I am Ryan McKnight, and this is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church going?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
skepticize everything.
Today is our 50th episode, and it's also March 16th, 2017. Welcome, and thank you for joining me. My name is Bryce Blankenagel. I know, episode 50, it's a completely arbitrary distinction, and, it's taken us nearly 2.5 years to get here, and there's actually over 100 episodes in the feed, but we have to take the time to celebrate once in a while, even if that celebration happens to be completely arbitrary like this. We have a lot of information to get through in this episode. Really, it's incredible. But before jumping into the November Court of Inquiry held against Joe and 63 other Mormons, I want to take a minute to talk to you guys about the podcast in general. All right. The last milestone that we celebrated was the first anniversary episode. That was the 7.5-hour Book of Mormon episode. That was nearly 1.5 years ago. So let's take episode 50 as a cause for another milestone celebration. So to give you a little bit of a peek behind the curtain, I'm also super excited that the downloads on this episode have finally ticked us over the 1 million overall downloads milestone. So, 50 episodes is one thing, but 1 million downloads simply sends me into ecstasy about this. I cannot believe it. So I'm going to take a brief few moments here to be a little prideful, okay? If you'll allow me humble license to do so. It's really exciting to hit these milestones, episode 50 and 1 million downloads. I don't want to say that I never thought we would actually get here, because that's simply not true. I always wanted this podcast to grow and expand, and I knew that with enough persistence and banging my head against the wall that we would eventually get here. I didn't know how long it would take, but here we are. But that's kind of my thing. And I'm just going to briefly share this about myself personally. When I put my mind to something that I truly want, I can seldom think of an example when it didn't happen or end up panning out in some way. But luck doesn't really have much to do with that. Most oftentimes, these passions have come to fruition through sheer brute force and, level 11 jackass bullheaded persistence. From the little struggles that hinder most episodes release until 11 p.m. on Thursday nights, or, force me to get a guest on the line a second time to re-record an interview, all the way to the broader overall struggle of somehow monetizing what most people consider a hobby, we've had our fair share of fights and frustrations and, overall struggles over the past nearly 2.5 years this podcast has been running. And I'm going to share this personal behind-the-scenes perspective briefly. The first time that I received a negative email from somebody that didn't like the show was around the same time that the first negative reviews began to trickle in. Maybe there's some correlation there. But when I received that first harsh email, I wanted to throw it all away, and delete any presence of the podcast from anywhere it may be hiding online. I wanted to delete the website and erase even the memory of having done anything even related to this podcast. I felt like a failure, right? I'd sunk so much time and energy and frustration into this, and it all felt lost. The entire endeavor felt like the most dramatic failure I had ever experienced in my life. It was like somebody was hitting my child, The number of positive reviews and the emails from people who liked the work simply didn't matter, with this cloud of negativity overhanging and altering my perspective and casting a shadow on everything I did for the weeks following it. Eventually, through persistence, those depressive feelings passed away, and a few more reviews and emails came in from people who liked it, and it took a long time for me to finally embrace the fact that you simply can't make everybody happy. And that was a tough realization to comprehend. Since a young age, I was always the peacemaker in the household. I couldn't stand the thought that somebody might be angry or sad because of me. I couldn't stand the thought that somebody didn't like this thing that I was pouring countless hours into, or worse yet, might not like me for some reason, right? But it's a fine balance to strike, caring what people think and also not letting what they say get to you, right? Eventually, I was able to reconcile the good and the bad reviews and emails by saying, you know what? I'm going to do what I'm going to do, regardless of what people say, which, kind of gets to that stubborn jackassery as earlier alluded to. Now, when people leave reviews or email me at nakedmormonism@gmail.com, I seriously consider what they have to say, but don't let it necessarily penetrate the calluses I've built up from the past bad emails and bad reviews in the past. This does a great disservice to the quality of the show, and more importantly, to you, the listeners. If one of you listeners are willing to take the time to say that there's something wrong, it's my duty to listen to what you have to say and take it under serious consideration, while still remembering that I'll never be able to make everybody happy. And more on that in a minute here. It's worth mentioning that any criticism somebody levels at me or the work that I'm doing pales in comparison to the level of self-criticism I've toiled with. That old adage of you are your own worst critic is absolutely true. And this brings me to a self-criticism I'm constantly fighting. I'm not a real historian. I'm just a fan of history. This does allow for certain liberties in the historical narrative that I may not take if I were a classically trained historian through conventional methods. There are reasons why historians are often careful with what they say. I was in a very extended discussion with Brent Metcalf this week in the Mormon Historians Facebook group, and it's incredibly clear that I'm capable of making connections and embracing assertions that simply may not be founded in reality, or may not be substantiated by the consensus around the historical record. Now, this allows for some much-needed wiggle room when telling stories, but that may cause such narratives and models to cripple under harsh historical scrutiny. Needless to say, if I could go back and start the historical timeline with the knowledge I now have, things would be different. I may have spent much less time on some parts and much more time on others, but I definitely would have done things differently. The problem is, I didn't know what I didn't know 2.5 years ago, and I seem to know even less about what I don't know now. That's the great endless paradox of any field of study that dives deep enough. The more you learn, the less you seem to know. But if I were to go back and redo all those early episodes, this journey would be lost as well. That's the thing with a dissertation for a degree or something. The people that'll be judging you only see the finished product. What might they think if they were judging the rough draft from the student's freshman year? I've made no bones about the fact that you are all taking this journey through Mormon history along with me. When I'm learning about Mormon history, it's usually limited to the content of that week's episode, or that 2 weeks historical episode, meaning I still know very little of the Nauvoo and Utah years. But I plan on learning as we go, and you, the listeners, will be learning at the same pace as me. But to wrap this all together, the reason I brought up criticisms earlier is I plan on answering some feedback that was both petitioned for and appreciated, and I plan on answering my own self-criticism of not being an historian. The Hans Mill episode featured a dramatized reading of the first-hand accounts. Many people liked it, others didn't, but the overwhelming consensus was to keep Naked Mormonism the historical monologue as it has always been. But that leaves the people who enjoyed the dramatized version high and dry, thus opening up an opportunity for expansion. Anyone listening to the show since the early days knows that I love to tell stories. And it just so happens that Mormon history is a rich medium from which to derive an historical fiction storyline. I mean, just ask Gerald Lund of the Work and the Glory series if you disagree. I've also been wanting to reboot the Glassbox podcast for quite some time, and thus presents our Convergence of Circumstances. Lately, I've been listening to a couple of those old-time radio shows, and personally, I think that a Mormon version of like an old-time radio show could be the perfect answer that keeps everybody happy. That allows for Naked Mormonism, this show, to stick with the historical monologue as we've been doing, and also allows a separate outlet for my insatiable need to tell a compelling story regardless of historicity. So without spending too much time on the details of an ever-evolving idea, it would require a small gathering of podcasters to voice our characters and an audio engineer to edit and produce everything with sound effects and a storyline and whatnot. I have a pilot and a second episode already scripted, but now comes the hard part of translating that jackass-like persistence and excitement about a project into actual reality. So let's put that on hold for a brief second to discuss something that I announced and I teased 2 weeks ago, and I mentioned it briefly last week. And this is to answer my own self-criticism of not being a real historian. One thing that real historians and journalists do is travel and visit the relevant places they're studying. You know, if you're a Bible scholar, it's a good idea to make the pilgrimage to the Holy Land at least once in your life. If you're a Mormon or a Mormon historian, there exists the Holy Mormon Pilgrimage throughout America that many Mormons never do, even though they believe in the church their whole lives. This pilgrimage includes Nauvoo and Carthage, Illinois, Kirtland, Ohio, Palmyra, New York, and of course, Utah, with some other little nearby stops thrown in there as well. At the time that this episode airs, that you are listening to this, I will be in my car leaving Seattle for the first leg of the journey beginning in Utah, reaching the halfway point in New York, and finally ending again back in Las Vegas. This journey means a number of things. First, Naked Mormonism will be taking its first ever hiatus during this time, and we will resume after ReasonCon on Star Wars Day, May the 4th. If you're listening in the backlog, this hiatus is largely irrelevant because you're just going to go on to the next episode after this one's over. But for those listening along as the show airs, we're taking a break to do some in-the-field research and journalism, and we will return in May with renewed energy and a lot to talk about as we crest the Liberty Jail threshold into the Nauvoo years. As many of you know, this podcast is my only source of income, and I, like many of you, can't just take a month with no income, especially as I'm going to be driving across the country spending nights in my tent because hotels cost too much. So if you're a subscriber on patreon.com/nakedmormonism, there will still be weekly content posted there for the month and a half that the podcast is on hiatus. Now, this content won't be podcast episodes, and it's going to vary greatly, including audio travel logs, Patreon exclusive video content or interviews, and all of that is not going to be part of the regular podcast or YouTube feed. You'll only be able to access that exclusive content by pledging to support this research and journalism. It doesn't even have to be $1 an episode. You know what? You can go on patreon.com/nakedmormonism and pledge a penny per episode, and you're going to gain access to that exclusive content. But I need to talk more on Patreon because I don't really have a boss that I can go to ask for a raise, nor do I use advertisers. It's all just supported through patreon.com, through listeners like you. So once in a while, we have to give Patreon the hard sell, beyond just thanking the newest Patreons at the end of the episode. So right now, I'm in the middle of my 2016 taxes. I have a pretty solid idea of how much I made in 2015 as opposed to 2016. Being a truck driver was a posh job with benefits. Now I'm a podcaster on Medicaid making roughly $6.50 an hour. And that's only if you calculate out to 50-hour weeks, and I haven't had a 50-hour week since I was a truck driver. If you extrapolate out the actual number of hours per week while deducting business costs and whatnot, that $6.50 an hour gets a little bit closer to the $4.50 an hour range. I consider myself very lucky to be able to do this podcast for a living without advertisers, but I'll just say it's not without its sacrifices. That being said, my personal living situation is comfortable. but there's absolutely zero room in the budget for growth and development. The only way that I'm able to fund this Mormon history pilgrimage is thanks to one little sentence in my grandma's will, and I can think of no better use for this small inheritance than making my first Mormon pilgrimage, you know? She would have been ecstatic to know that I was using an inheritance this way. You know, I read off the new patrons every 2 weeks, but the trickle of new subscribers doesn't match the number of people who have let their card expire. We reached the goal for Nemo Home Evenings 2 months ago, but alas, with the usual fluctuation of new people and people who let their cards expire, we're back to being a few dollars short of that goal. So here's the hard sell, okay? Get us up to the next Patreon goal, and we will reboot the Glassbox podcast as an old school radio storytelling version of Mormon history. And if you are one of those people who've let your card expire, maybe, consider logging into patreon.com and renewing, because you're still getting the extra content. You're just not paying for it. I don't have any way of removing those people. So, you're freeloaders, but it's okay. Like, I wouldn't want to remove you anyway. Just maybe consider renewing it. But if you subscribe to the Patreon feed, that's going to be the best way to keep up with this cross-country travels, along with the interviews and the videos that I'm going to be shooting and whatnot. And also, I'm going to be taking that little 360 camera that I had for the Mythicist Milwaukee interview, and I'm taking a regular point-and-shoot camera as well to chronicle everything. And that's all going to be posted up on the Patreon page. Here are the numbers, okay? If 2% of the people listening right now pledged $1 an episode, that would get us not only to the next goal to reboot the Glassbox podcast, but to the goal after that, sending me back to church. Now, you listening, you can say that, other people listening, they're probably going to heed this seemingly desperate plea for my hard-earned money. I can't really afford it. They'll take care of it. But, you're wrong, because everybody thinks that. I'm not talking to the 5 other listeners of the show. I'm talking to you right now who are listening to this, the person that's shaking their head at this whole intro because it sounds like an NPR pledge drive or something. We need your help. I need your help to not only keep this going, but to invest in research and development to make it even better. Don't be part of the 5 other listeners who consume just the free content. Treat yourself a little bit, Join the Nemo family and count yourself among the ranks of the Nemo elite by gaining access to the premium extended edition episodes, as well as all the extra content that's going to be coming out of this cross-country Mormon history pilgrimage and beyond. You owe it to yourself to indulge a little bit when it comes to Mormon history. And, you can do it for 4 pennies a month. But more important than anything else, it would be absurd of me if I didn't thank all of you for simply making all of this a possibility. Without listeners, without all of you, this show simply doesn't exist. And I really have you to thank and everything that you have done. From the earliest people like Hal Prentice that got in touch with me to the people that are still sending in emails, on a weekly basis. I love hearing from you and talking to you. Thank you all so much. And of course, I'm looking for tips and hints for this Mormon pilgrimage. Some of you may have gone to some of these places that are Mormon hotspots. If there are places you think of that might be off the beaten path, or that, I need to check out, or maybe shoot some footage, send me an email, get in touch with me, or get in touch on Facebook or Twitter. I'd love to talk to you and, hear from some people who have made this pilgrimage themselves. And, maybe there's some good eateries along the way too that you guys can let me in on. So yeah, I really look forward to making this kind of like a crowd success type thing with all of this pilgrimage. I'm so looking forward to doing it because I have for so long. I've been planning it for quite some time now, and now that it's come to fruition, I'm just super stoked and excited to go and finally see these places firsthand that I've been studying for the past 4.5 years. It's so exciting. If you can't hear the excitement in my voice, it's you should see my face. My grin is from ear to ear right now. It's just There's no way to properly express how excited I am about, seeing these places and actually standing in Carthage jail and, seeing the Smith home rebuilt, the version that they have there. It's gonna be so cool to see. Looking forward to it so much. And not to belabor the point to complete annoyance, but I'm not done asking for your help, okay? And this is a much more direct plea for help than financial support on patreon.com/nakedmormonism. I told you guys that I'm going to be taking a point-and-shoot camera with me as well as the little 360 video camera. And this provides some great opportunities. In the past, I've received a small number of emails from people who say that they have an old family journal or they have some old letters in a trunk or something that I might be interested in. Well, I'm always interested in those, but my answer is always something along the lines of, I don't want your great-grandma's old journal because it's a family heirloom and it doesn't belong with me. If it belongs anywhere, it should be in an historical library or with the Community of Christ or something to that effect. So I always refuse those offers from people who want to send me those old documents. Well, now we have a great opportunity to meet in person and for me to take pictures of that old journal or something. If you have an old newspaper or journal or, letter exchanges with your ancestors or something, or an old book or something like that, anything that you think I may be interested in or may be relevant, Mormon or not, just something historical, send me an email. Get in touch, nakedmormonism@gmail.com, or go to the contact form on nakedmormonismpodcast.com. Those go to the same email. I would consider it an honor to come and photograph whatever you have and leave it in your rightful possession. And I'm willing to drive significantly out of my way on this cross-country travels to make that happen. Because that's what real historians and journalists do, and that's how I'm able to answer my own self-criticism. Historians and journalists travel to relevant places and speak to relevant people to bring to the scholarly world information which was previously unknown. And we have all benefited endlessly from what the world of Mormon history has to offer. So let's give a little something back. All right. That wraps it up. Okay. We're going to answer feedback by rebooting the Glassbox podcast, and I'm on my way to embark upon a cross-country Mormon history pilgrimage, and please support our efforts at patreon.com/nakedmormonism. Simple as that. I would have saved that for the end of the episode, but many people just turned off after we're done with the historical portion. So I figured for this, kind of this special occasion, I'm going to include that before the historical portion. But now, let's get into it, okay? We have a lot to get through today. Our last milestone episode was 7.5 hours, but I'm going to try and stay a little bit under that for the sake of everybody's sanity. The last historical episode covered the surrender of the Mormon leadership and the twin refuge cities of Far West and Diamond, crippling the last places the Mormons could safely live in Missouri. The terms of surrender forced the Mormons to uproot their lives once again and leave Missouri, as per the extermination order. And now we get to the subsequent court of inquiry following the surrender. So once General Clark arrived at the camp of General Lucas, on the outskirts of Far West where the Mormons had surrendered, General Clark enforced the negotiated surrender terms and took custody of Joe and the other detained Mormon leaders. Nearly 50 other Mormons were dragged to Richmond with the leadership to stand as defendants or witnesses or, just to participate in the court of inquiry, which would span from November 12th to the 29th, 1838. Now, there are some finicky legal details here. This was a court of inquiry. It wasn't even a grand jury hearing. Now, a grand jury is held to determine if there is sufficient evidence to bring charges against a suspect, after which a jury trial proceeds. A court of inquiry is a step or two below a grand jury, and in Missouri in the 1800s, it was only reserved for military situations. And on the very first page of the November court documents, we find this information from the various committees that were investigating the Mormons' crimes in Missouri. Quote, The documents may be divided into several classes. First, the affidavits and correspondence preceding each series of authorized military operations. Second, the orders issued upon such evidence. Third, the military operations and correspondence consequent thereon. And fourth, the evidence taken before a court of inquiry held for the investigation of criminal charges against individuals. The copy of the examination taken before the criminal court of inquiry is manifestly not such evidence as ought to be received by the committee. First, because it is not authenticated, and second, it is confined chiefly to the object of that inquiry, namely the investigation of criminal charges against individuals under arrest for those reasons. But above all, for the reason that it would be a direct interference with the administration of justice. This document ought not to be published with the sanction of the legislature. The committee concludes that it would not be proper to publish the official orders and correspondence between the officers in command and the executive without the evidence on which they were founded, and that evidence is not sufficiently full or satisfactory to authorize its publication. And this is the kicker line. To publish the whole together might tend to give a direction to the public mind prejudicial to an impartial administration of justice in finding cases. End quote. So what did that tell us? Right there, it tells us that this court of inquiry should not be published or used for any reason, really, in any full grand jury trial or for bringing charges against Joe and the Mormons. That passage right there explains why these documents weren't released until 1841, nearly 3 years after this court of inquiry was held. And that sets our tone for the legality of this situation. As soon as Joe and the Mormons surrendered, General Lucas held that little court-martial during which he sentenced Joe and Lyman White, Sidney Rigdon, Hiram Smith, the other Mormon leaders, all to death by firing squad the next morning. Those executions were derailed thanks to General Donovan. And this court of inquiry was held during the following 2 weeks to, build up a facade of proper law proceedings, but it was still flawed. Nobody was really playing by the rule books here, and some innocent people suffered violation of habeas corpus and a right to a speedy and fair trial as the byproduct. But let's get into the actual court of inquiry here. We're going to spend this episode reading court documents to try and put us into the pews of that 1838 courtroom. Now, a few things to point out before getting started. These proceedings occurred over 17 8-hour days and generated over 200 pages of documents, most of which I've read through by this point. We simply cannot discuss every testimony without this episode being the longest we've ever done by orders of magnitude. We'll also be exposed to many names on both sides of the conflict with whom we've never dealt before. I have purposefully omitted them for the sake of brevity. So I'm going to try my best to give a brief background or even like a, simplistic label such as Mormon or anti-Mormon, which, arguably leaves a lot of necessary nuance out of the conversation. But we have to use those simplistic labels for time and logistical constraints. But we'll do our best to compile the most representative testimonies and move through the documents as concisely as possible. Everything we discuss in this episode is from one source, unless otherwise stated. The state of Missouri government their historical office has published PDF and text copies of the entire archive of court documents, and anybody can see these on sos.mo.gov archive website, and you'll find a link to it in the show notes under the title Mormon War Papers 1837 to 1841. Now, normally, I don't really get off on just straight reading you guys court documents, but there have been those select few trials in Joe's lifetime where doing anything other than reading the court documents just sells the situation short of what really happened. Previously, we've read the infamous 1826 glass-looking trial, the two 1830 trials, which were 1 week apart. And of course, we briefly covered the lawsuit that Grandison Newell brought against Joe, claiming he'd commanded 2 Mormons to assassinate Newell. Among the dozens of court appearances Joe's made by this point, those are the few most important appearances, which is why we've covered them in detail. But the seriousness of all of those trials combined pale in comparison to how crucial this trial was in Joe's life. A guilty verdict from this court of inquiry could realistically lead to a death penalty following the impending civil trial. There was truly no other trial in Joe's life more important than these 17 days in November of 1838. The presiding judge over this, and yes, I said singular judge, for this court of inquiry was Judge Austin A. King, a name that's come up. That was the same judge who presided over the trial over Joe and Lyman White on Raglan's farm back in September, and that trial was held in response to the Danites surrounding the homes of government officials. Now, Judge King wasn't really a detached observer in this situation, and he should have recused himself. There may be more to his motivations than really meets the eye, and we're going to try to get into that at the end of the episode. But for now, let's do it. Let's dive in face first and see what we're met with. First off, let's begin with reading the charges, because without them, no court of inquiry exists. So I'm going to read off every name of those individuals who were charged, and I only do that because some of you may recognize your ancestors' names in here. Now, Abraham Palmer, my ancestor, he's not in here, but there may be some familiar names through here. So here it is. Quote, State versus Joseph Smith, Hiram Smith, Sidney Rigdon, Parley Pratt, Lyman White, Amasa Lyman, George Robinson, Caleb Baldwin, Alanson Ripley, Washington Voorhees, Sidney Turner, John Buchanan, Jacob Gates, Chandler Halbrook, George Harris, Jesse Hunter, Andrew Whitlock, Martin Allred, William Allred, George Grant, Darwin Chase, Elijah Newman, Alvin Tippett, Zedekiah Owens, Isaac Morley, Thomas Buck, Moses Clausen, John Tanner, Daniel Shearer, Daniel Thomas, Alexander McCrae, Alicia Edwards, John Higby, Ebenezer Page, Benjamin Covey, Ebenezer Robinson, Lyman Gibbs, James Henderson, Dave Pettigrew, Edward Partridge, Francis Higby, David Frampton, George Kimball, Joseph Younger, Henry Zabriskie, Alan Stout, Sheffield Daniels, Silas Menard, Anthony Head, Benjamin Jones, Daniel Carn, John T. Earl, and Norman Shearer, all who were charged with the several crimes of high treason against the state, murder, burglary, arson, robbery, and larceny. End quote. The first 7 names, except for Amasa Lyman, we recognize as the first group of Mormon leaders who were taken as hostage on October 31st, prior to the Mormons' surrender on November 1st. But there were a few unexpected names, as well as a few names missing that we might expect to see. For example, Dr. Samson Avard. He was Brigadier General over the Danites, second only to Captain General Elias Higby, who had fled far west before its surrender. How was Samson Avard not a member of the 53 accused Mormons that we just read? Well, that was a question on the minds of the accused Mormons as well. Samson Avard was a primary Danite insider who'd participated in the Mormon depredations of Daviess County, which led to the Battle of Crooked River and Haun's Mill Massacre and everything that we're talking about now, and eventually culminated in the surrender in the first place. Why was Dr. Samson Avard not charged? Well, the first witness was called to the stand. And here we begin reading our testimonies. Quote, Samson Avard, a witness, produced, sworn, and examined, on behalf of the state, deposeth and saith that about 4 months ago a band called the Daughters of Zion, since called the Danite Band, was formed of the members of the Mormon Church, the original object of which was to drive from the county of Caldwell all those who dissented from the Mormon Church, in which they succeeded admirably, and to the satisfaction of all concerned. I consider Joseph Smith Jr. as the prime mover and organizer of this Danite band. The officers of the band, according to their grades, were brought before him at a schoolhouse together with Hiram Smith and Sidney Rigdon, the 3 composing the first presidency of the whole church. Joseph Smith then blessed them. Then he prophesied over them, declaring that they should be the means in the hands of God of bringing forth the millennial kingdom. It was stated by Joseph Smith Jr. that it was necessary this band should be bound together by a covenant, that those who revealed the secrets of this society should be put to death, The covenant taken by all the Danite band was as follows, to wit. They declared, holding up their right hands, in the name of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, I do solemnly obligate myself ever to conceal and never to reveal the secret purposes of this society called the Daughters of Zion. Should I ever do the same, I hold my life as the forfeiture. The prophet Joseph Smith, together with his two counselors, Hiram and Smith and Sidney Rigdon, were considered as the supreme head of the church, and the Danite band feel themselves as much bound to obey them as to obey the supreme God. Instruction was given by Joseph Smith Jr. that if any of them should get into difficulty, the rest should help him out, and that they should stand by each other, right or wrong. This instruction was given at a Danite meeting, in a public address. As for Joseph Smith Jr. and his two counselors, the witness does not know that they ever took the Danite oath. He knows that all the rest of the defendants are Danites, except Sidney Tanner, Andrew Whitlock, and then a bunch of people that it names off here. At the election last August, a report came to Far West that some of the brethren in Daviess County were killed. I called for 20 volunteers to accompany me to Daviess to see this matter. I went, and about 120 Mormons accompanied me to Adam-on-Diamond, Mr. Joseph Smith Jr. and company. When we arrived there, I found the report exaggerated. None were killed. We visited Mr. Adam Black, about 150 or 200 men of us armed. Joseph Smith was commander, and if Black had not signed the paper he did, it was the common understanding and belief that he would have shared the fate of the dissenters, meaning being removed or killed. Sidney Rigdon and Lyman White were at Adam-on-Diamond when we went to Black's and advised the movement. As regards to the affair at DeWitt, I know little personally, but I heard Mr. Sidney Rigdon say they had gone down to DeWitt, where it is said a mob had collected to wage war upon the Mormons residing in Carroll County, and that Joseph Smith Jr. with his friends went down to DeWitt to give aid and help to his brethren. The company, as I presume, were armed. Hiram Smith and George Robertson were in the company. Amasa Lyman went to see what was going on. I heard these persons say they were in Hinkle's camp at DeWitt several days. When the Mormons returned from DeWitt, it was rumored that a mob was collecting in Daviess County. Joseph Smith Jr., the Sunday before the late disturbances in Daviess, at a church meeting, gave notice that he wished the whole county collected on the next day at Far West. He declared on Sunday or Monday, I do not recollect which, that all who did not take up arms in defense of the Mormons at Daviess should be considered as Tories and should take their exit from the county. At the meeting on Monday, when persons met from all parts of the county of Caldwell, Joseph Smith Jr. took the pulpit and delivered an address, in which he said that we had been an injured people driven violently from Jackson County, that we had appealed to the governor, magistrates, judges, and even to the President of the United States, and there had been no redress for us, and that now a mob was about to destroy the rights of our brethren of Daviess County, and that it was high time that we should take measures to defend our own rights. In the address, he related an anecdote about a captain who applied to a Dutchman to purchase potatoes, who refused to sell them. The captain then charged his company several different times not to touch the Dutchman's potatoes. In the morning, the Dutchman had not a potato left in his patch. This was in reference to touching no property in our expedition to Daviess County that did not belong to us, but he told us that the children of God did not go to war at their own expense. I'm going to pause for a quick second here, because the story of the Dutchman's potatoes, that is multiply accounted by multiple people. Joe told this old story about this Dutchman's potatoes and this captain who told his troops, don't you touch those potatoes now. But the next day when they woke up, there wasn't a potato left, because in the middle of the night, in defiance of the captain's orders, all of the men went and dug up the potatoes because they were hungry. And Joe applied the same logic to the Mormon depredations. That he said, don't you go stealing all that stuff. I'm going to tell you right here in this public square, don't you go take all of the stuff of the Gentiles, while, hush, hush, saying under his breath, just go loot it all. Take it. It's okay. So That's where it says the Dutchman's potatoes. I didn't cover that in previous episodes. Everything that this testimony is discussed up to this point, we've discussed in the past historical episodes, but that story of the Dutchman's potatoes, I didn't include it, and there are multiple references to it in these testimonies, so that's what it's talking about, just to cue you in on what it's discussing here. Continuing on with Samson of Ard's testimony, quote, "A vote was taken whether the brethren should embody and go down to Davies to attack the mob. The question was put by the prophet Joseph Smith and passed unanimously with a few exceptions. Captains Patton and Brunson were appointed commanders of the Mormons by Joseph Smith Jr. to go to Davis. He frequently called these men generals. I once had a command as an officer, but Joseph Smith Jr. removed me from it, and I asked him the reason, and he assigned that he had another office for me. Afterwards, Mr. Rigdon told me I was to fill the office of surgeon to attend to the sick and wounded. After we arrived at Diamond in Davies, a council was held at night, composed of Joseph Smith Jr., George Robertson, Hiram Smith, Captains Patton and Brunson, Lyman White, President Reynolds Cahoon, Parley Pratt, and myself, and perhaps Mr. Hinkle, and President Rigdon was not present. He remained at Far West. A correspondence was kept between him and Joseph Smith Jr. I heard Mr. Rigdon read one of the letters from Smith, which, as I remember, was about as follows, that he knew from prophecy and from the revelation of Jesus Christ that the enemies of the kingdom were in their hands, and that they, meaning the Mormon Church, should succeed. Rigdon, on reading the letter, said it gave him great consolation to have such authority that the kingdom of God was rolling on. In the above referred to council, Mr. Smith spoke of the grievances we had suffered in Jackson, Clay, Kirtland, and other places, declared that we must in future stand up for our rights as citizens of the United States and as saints of the Most High God, and that if it was the will of God, we should do so. That we should be free and independent, and that as the state of Missouri and the United States would not protect us, it was high time that we should, as the saints of the Most High God, protect ourselves and take the kingdom. Lyman White observed that before the winter was over, he thought he would be in St. Louis and take it. Smith charged them that they should be united in supporting each other. Smith said on some occasion that one should chase 1,000 and two put 10,000 to flight, that he considers the United States rotten. He compared the Mormon Church to the little stone spoken of by the prophet Daniel, and that the dissenters first and the state next was part of the image that should be destroyed by this little stone. The council was called on to vote the measures of Smith, which they did unanimously. On the next day, Captain Patton, who was called by prophet Captain Fear Not, took command of about 100 armed men and told them that he had a job for them to do, that the work of the Lord was rolling on, and that they must be united. He then led his troops to Gallatin, saying he was going to attack the mob there. He made a rush into Gallatin, dispersed the few men there, and took the goods out of Stoling's store and carried them to Diamond. And I afterwards saw the storehouse on fire. When we returned to Diamond, the goods were deposited in the Lord's storehouse under the care of Bishops Vincent Knight. Orders were strictly given that all the goods should be deposited in the Lord's storehouse. No individuals were to appropriate anything to themselves until a general distribution should be made. Joseph Smith Jr. was at Adam-on-Diamond giving directions about things in general connected with the war when Patton returned from Gallatin to Adam-on-Diamond. The goods were divided or apportioned out amongst those engaged, and these affairs were conducted under the superintendency of the First Presidency. A part of the goods were brought to Far West on their arrival under the care of Captain Fear Not. President Rigdon and others shouted 3 hosannas to the victors. On the day Patton went to Gallatin, Colonel White, meaning Lyman White, went to Millport, and I saw a great many candles, bed, furniture, etc. brought into our camps by the Mormons. After we returned to Far West, the troops were constantly kept in motion, and there was a council held at the house of President Rigdon to determine who should be the chiefs. It was determined that Colonel White should be commander-in-chief at Adam-on-Diamond. Brunson, meaning Seymour Brunson, captain of the Flying Horse of Davies. Colonel Hinkle should be the commander-in-chief and the chief of the Far West troops. Captain Patton, captain of the Flying Horse or Cavalry, and that the Prophet Joseph Smith Jr. should be commander-in-chief of the whole kingdom. The council was composed of Joseph Smith Jr., Captain Fearnought, alias Patton, Colonel Hinkle, Colonel White, and President Rigdon. The object of the council was in furtherance of the scheme proposed in council in Daviess County referred to above. After this council, Fearnought disputed as to the chief commander of the Far West troops and had a smart altercation about it with Hinkle, but Smith proposed that they agree to disagree and go on for the good of the kingdom. The troops were kept together until the militia came out lately. There was from 500 to 800 men, as I supposed, under arms. It was about this time that the militia came out lately to Far West under General Lucas, that our prophet assembled the troops together at Far West in a hollow square and addressed them and stated to them that the kingdom of God should be set up and should never fall. And for everyone that we lacked in numbers of those who came against us, the Lord would send angels who would fight for us, and that we should be victorious. After the militia had been near Far West a while, in an address Smith said that those troops were militia, and that we were militia too, and both sides clever fellows, and that he advises them to know nothing of what had happened, to say nothing and to keep dark, that he, Smith, had forgotten more than he had ever known. After it was ascertained that the militia had arrived, intelligence was immediately sent to Diamond to Colonel White. Next morning, Colonel White arrived in Far West with about 100 mounted armed men. The troops were constantly kept prepared and in a situation to repel attack. The evening the militia arrived near Far West, it was the general understanding in the Mormon camps that they were militia legally called out, and indeed, previous to their arrival, it was ascertained that there were militia on their way to Far West. Some months ago, I received orders to destroy the paper concerning the Danite Society, which order was issued by the First Presidency, and which paper, being the Constitution for the government of the Danite Society, was in my custody, but which I did not destroy. Samson of Ard, that's what happened. He had the Danite Manifesto in his hands, or not the manifesto, sorry, the Danite Constitution. He had that in his possession. He was told to destroy it, but he said, I'm going to hang on to this just in case I need it. And next he says, it is now in General Clark's possession. I gave the paper up to General Clark after I was taken prisoner. I found it in my house where I had previously deposited it, and believe it had never been in any person's possession after I had received it. This paper was taken into President Rigdon's house and read to the prophet and his counselors, and was unanimously adopted by them as their rule and guide in the future. After it was thus adopted, I was instructed by the council to destroy it, as, if it should be discovered, it would be considered treasonable. He's right. This Constitution, after it was approved of by the First Presidency, was read article by article to the Danite band and unanimously adopted by them. This paper was drawn up about the time that the Danite band was formed. Since the drawing up of the paper against the dissenters, it was that this Constitution of the Danite band was drafted, but I have no minutes of the time, as we were directed not to keep written minutes, which Constitution above referred to is as follows. And then it goes on to read the Danite Constitution, which we have read before. I'm not going to belabor it and read it again. We're just going to continue on with Samson of Ard's testimony. In connection with the grand scheme of the prophet, his preachers and apostles were instructed to preach and to instruct their followers, who are estimated in Europe and America at about 40,000. That's a really high estimate. It was a little closer to 10,000. That it was their duty to come up to the stake called Far West and to possess the kingdom, that it was the will of God that they should do so, and that the Lord would give them power to possess the kingdom. There was another writing drawn up in June last, which had for its object to get rid of the dissenters, that's the Danite Manifesto, and which had the desired effect. Since that time, and since the introduction of the scheme of the prophet made known in the above constitution, I have the prophet say that it was a fortunate thing that we got rid of the dissenters, as they would have endangered the rolling on of the kingdom, as introduced and to be carried into effect by the Danite band. That they, the dissenters, were great obstacles in the way, and unless they were removed, the aforesaid kingdom could not roll on. This paper against the dissenters was drafted by Sidney Rigdon and is as follows. And next it has hyperlinked up the Danite Manifesto, which we have read from before. We've covered that extensively. We're not going to. I'm just going to continue on with Samson of Ard's testimony. The above was signed by some 84 Mormons, Far West, June 1838. About the time the dissenters fled, President Rigdon preached a sermon from the text, "Ye are the salt of the earth, but if the salt hath lost its savor, wherewith shall it be salted? It is therefore good for nothing but to be cast out and to be trodden under foot of men," commonly called the Salt Sermon, in which the dissenters were called the salt that had lost its savor, and that they should be trampled upon and driven out by the saints, which was well understood by the Danites to be part of their duty to do. Man, Samson of Ard isn't holding anything back here. When General Lucas's men marched up to Far West, Smith told me, as I understood him, that he had said to one of the militia captains not to come any further as he might get into danger. Smith, after erecting his bulwarks, asked me if I did not think him pretty much of a general, and I answered in the affirmative. We were advised all the time to fight valiantly, that the angels of the Lord would appear in our defense and fight our battles. In reference to Bogart's battle, I know but little personally as to the start of the troops to fight Bogart. I was called upon to go along with the company, which was commanded by Patton, as surgeon. This was about midnight, but as I thought a little sleep would do me more good than fighting, I remained at home. I don't really blame him, right? In the morning of the fight, this is Crooked River, at about 6 o'clock, I was called on by a Mr. Emmett, who informed me that Captain Fearnought was wounded mortally. I went to Patton about 3 miles from the battleground, where I found Joseph Smith Jr. present, laying hands on the wounded and blessing them to heal them. Abraham O'Banion was also mortally wounded. I never heard Hiram Smith make any inflammatory remarks, but I have looked upon him as one composing the first presidency, acting in concert with Joseph Smith Jr., approving by his president's acts and conversations the unlawful schemes of the presidency. I never saw Edward Partridge and Isaac Morley, two of the defendants, take any active part in the above measure testified to by me, but I have heard Joseph Smith Jr. say he considered Partridge a coward and backward and ought to be forced out or comply. I was continually in the society of the presidency, receiving instructions from them as to the teachings of the Danite band, and I continually informed them of my teachings, and they were all apprised of my course and teachings in the Danite society. End quote. The state opened up with their secret weapon. This fearless, bad cop, brigadier general of the Danites, Samson of Ard, upon the Mormons' surrender, took the deal that Lyman White refused in the camp. He provided the damning testimony, indicting Joe and everybody else by name with connections to the Danites and the Mormon depredations. He explicitly told the court of inquiry everything they needed to know about the Mormons and their military depredations and their organizational tactics, and the simple fact remains, if not for Samson of Ard's testimony, the historical connections we have of Joe to the Danites are a little bit thin. And for that matter, without Avard's testimony, this court never would have proceeded the way that it did and never would have gathered the necessary evidence to, let's say, quasi-convict the Mormon leadership. This was the opening testimony to help set the tone for the entire 16 days following. After Avard's testimony and learning of Orson Hyde and Thomas Marsh's defections, which led to Haun's Mill, the prophet was beginning to acquire a palate for the bitter taste of betrayal. But the testimonies were only getting started. The rest of the testimonies we read will be structured not chronologically, but by perspective. We started with Samson of Vards because it was the first testimony heard in the court. The next block of testimonies will come from people on the non-Mormon side of the conflict. After that, we'll shift to people who experienced things from the Mormon perspective. Now, the distinction may not be so clear at the onset, but I'm going to try and qualify each witness as we go, just for the ease of listening so you know where they're coming from. The next testimony we'll read is from Captain Samuel Bogart, who was a commanding officer who was assaulted by Captain Fearnot's Danite troops on Crooked River. Samuel Bogart had been an anti-Mormon militia leader this entire conflict. He's played an important part. And this is his testimony. Quote, Captain Samuel Bogart, a witness produced sworn and examined for the state, deposeth and saith that on the evening of October 24th last, while ranging under the orders of General Atchison, as is below inserted, I met with several Mormons and read it to them, supposing that they would inform the Mormons of Caldwell the characters of my company. We had been informed on that evening by citizens of Ray that we were in danger of being attacked by the Mormons that night, whereupon I fell back to an encampment on Crooked River in Ray County. On the next morning, near daybreak, my picket guard gave information that we were coming, and in a few moments I saw the Mormon forces forming, and a few guns were fired out of the brush by the Mormons. When the fight commenced, the left wing of the Mormon forces were within about 30 steps of my sight, and in numbers were about 150 or 200, as I supposed. And further, this deponent saith not. Signed, Samuel Bogart. And Bogart also produced the letter that he used to justify taking the Mormon prisoners in the first place, which led to the Mormons' assault on Crooked River. And this is the letter, quote, Captain Samuel Bogart, Sir, your communication by express has been received. You are hereby ordered to range the line between Caldwell and Ray counties with your company of volunteers and prevent, if possible, any invasion of Ray County by any persons in arms whatever. You will also take care to inquire into the state of things in Daviess County and make report thereof to me from time to time. I will endeavor to be with you in a few days. Signed, David R. Atchison, Major General of 3rd Division of the Missouri Militia. End quote. All right, we're going to try and keep any extra documents beyond just the actual testimonies to a limit, but this one was short and very relevant. From this order, we see that General Atchison, who was still the field commanding officer on October 24th when this was produced, commanding Captain Bogart to simply stop armed people from crossing the county line. There's nothing about taking prisoners in there. So when Bogart took those Mormons prisoners, that was interpreted as an aggressive action to which the Mormons retaliated. And they aggressively retaliated at Crooked River, which led to Captain Fearnot's death. Now, this detail muddies the water significantly when the court and us today try to lay the blame on somebody. Nobody was really in the right in this situation. So the next testimony we're going to read is from a man named Wyatt Cravens, and he was one of Bogart's men who were taken prisoner after the Battle of Crooked River, and he was subsequently shot and recovered when he was released. It's a really interesting situation. This is how he remembers the Battle of Crooked River and what happened afterwards. Quote, Wyatt Cravens, a witness, produced and sworn, examined for the state, deposeth and saith, he was one in Captain Bogart's company, and was present in the fight with the Mormons on the 25th of October last. About a daybreak in Ray City, Parley P. Pratt and Captain Patton appeared in command of the company that made an attack upon us. We were lying in camp when we heard them coming. We got up and prepared for battle. The Mormons came in about 60 yards of us and formed the line of battle. They approached in a body, numbering as near as I could guess about 150, armed with guns, swords, and pistols to within about 40 yards of us. When the firing commenced by both parties about the same time, I can't say which side fired first, I was taken prisoner by the Mormons. I saw Joseph Smith Jr. come to the Mormons at a house in Log Creek Timber a few miles from the battleground. The wounded were taken out of the wagon then, and we started on towards far west. Joseph Smith Jr. passed on by me to the head of the company, where Pratt and White halted the company. He, Pratt, and 4 others rode off a piece and conferred together, and then returned to the company, and called out some captain and ordered him to call out 10 of his braves. 7 men came out, and I was placed under their guard, and told by White that they would escort me off and let me go about my business. Okay, so after the Battle of Crooked River, there was, this group of Mormons who were escorting Wyatt Cravens, their prisoner of war, towards Diamond. And then they said, Joseph told him, hey, we're going to send you with this smaller group of people. We're going to let you go about your business. And that's that. So no problem, right? They declared I should be guarded no further, and pointed out the path I should take, which led around the fence. I then thought the man who had not returned had been placed round the fence to kill me. But I was determined to do the best I could to make my escape. So in this group of people that were escorting him, a few of them left to go scout out where they were, and then when they returned, one of them was missing. And Wyatt was like, well, where is that guy? Is he just going to kill me as soon as I go walking out there? That seems like a rational question, right? He goes on to say, in passing on, I discovered my direction would lead me to where I thought the man was placed, and I took off to the right, and immediately I was ordered to stop by some person, whom I recognized to be the man of the guard who left with the captain of the guard, and did not return. I fled and turned my head to look, and saw the man with his gun in a shooting position, and shortly after, while I was running, I was shot by him, and I made my way to Ray County. Parley P. Pratt was in the battle. Moses Rollins, one of Captain Bogart's men, and several of the Mormons was killed in the battle. 5 of Bogart's company, including myself, were wounded, and further, this deponent saith not. Signed, C. Wyatt Cravens. End quote. There's a bit of historical conjecture surrounding what happened to Wyatt Cravens, but from his testimony, it sounds like the Mormons took him prisoner and then released him in a planned way so that they could shoot him and kill him. It's not surprising. The Mormons had lost a few people at that point, and they weren't sure how many of Captain Bogart's troops had been killed at the battle. So why not kill this prisoner, right? There's a lot of conjecture surrounding Wyatt Cravens here. That's why I included his testimony here. But this was kind of the tone of the anti-Mormon testimonies, and they were only just getting started here. The inequality experienced by the Mormons in the courtroom with all these anti-Mormon witnesses was not lost on them in the moment, nor has that sense of inequality evaporated since this happened in the 180 years subsequent. This court of inquiry really played into the Mormon persecution complex back then, and it really contributes in subtle ways even today. The next testimony we'll read is from a man named William Splawn, a Daviess County citizen who had been confronted by the Danites concerning John Raglan, who was the owner of the farm where Joe and Lyman White had stood trial in September with Judge King on the panel. And this is how William Splawn remembers the situation. Quote, William Splawn, a witness produced, sworn, and examined on behalf of the state, deposeth and saith, I was at Eli Bagley's in Daviess County when an armed company of men, about 10 or 12 in number, came there. James Rollins and Jesse Hunter, 2 of the defendants who were of the company, they came to Bagley's. They inquired who I was and if I was a mob character, and learning I was not, they let me alone. They inquired for John Raglan, and said they heard he was a mob character, and he had gone for men to fight them, and if they had got their eyes on him, they would take his life, and that he had better keep out of the way. To be positive that Hunter was of the company, I will not, but I have little or no doubt of it from his appearance. This was on Saturday after I learned that Gallatin was burned, the Thursday before and during the time the Mormon troops were in Daviess, and further, this deponent saith not. Signed, William Splawn. So what happened here? About a dozen Danites had confronted Splawn and asked if he knew where to find John Raglan because, well, they just wanted to talk with him. Or, as they sounded like they said, they wanted to kill him because he was a mob character. He was looking for people to raise a mob. Now, Raglan had been incredibly opposed to the Mormons this whole time, and he was suspected as being a leader of an anti-Mormon mob without state-sanctioned militia status, which was a problem. He was a mobocrat. And I don't think there's any way to tell what the Danites would have done had they actually encountered Raglan and his mob. But I doubt an actual firefight would have broken out. That doesn't seem likely. But the Mormons were trying to keep tabs on their enemies as much as possible. And it just so happened that Raglan was one of those people that they were tracking. And the next testimony picks up where William Splawn left off. And it's from a Daviess County citizen named Thomas Odell, who was living on Raglan's farm and was suspected to be an anti-Mormon mobocrat himself. Quote, Thomas M. Odell, a witness produced, sworn, and examined on behalf of the state, deposeth and saith that on the Saturday after Gallatin was burnt, and an armed company of 12 men rode up to Mr. Raglan's house in Daviess County where I resided, they inquired for John Raglan. I told them where he had gone. They said their object was to drive the mob from the county and said that I must go. I replied that I could not, that I had no way to get off, and that my family were barefooted. They replied that made no difference, I must go, and said if I was not gone by next morning by sunrise, they would take my life. They told Mrs. Raglan she must be put out, that there she could not stay, and that Raglan had better never show himself there, that they would take his life if ever they set their eyes on him. Next morning, by the assistance of friends, we did start leaving most of our property there. Since then, I have returned and found the houses burnt and the property gone, consisting of household plunder and 29 bee gums. Those are like beehives. They inquired for gums and got down one and took it away from the house belonging to one Josiah Littlefield. They had these beehives, and the Mormons were looting the bee gums that they were taking for the honey, of course. They further said that they had been driven as long as they were going to, that they had got strong enough now to defend themselves, that they intended to do it by the sword, that they were at the defiance of any set of men who could come against them, and that they now intended to make it a war of extermination. The following of the defendants were in the company: James Rawlins, Jesse Hunter, Darwin Chase, and I think from his appearance, Morris Phelps was there, but may be mistaken. Hunter appeared to be captain or commander of the company, as he did most of the talking, but most all of them had something to say, and further, this deponent saith not. Signed, Thomas M. Odell. So next, we have a small testimony from the John Raglan, who the Mormons were tracking and making death threats against. And he was giving his whereabouts at the times that the Danites confronted Thomas Odell on Raglan's farm concerning Raglan's whereabouts. Quote, John Raglan, a witness produced, sworn, and examined on behalf of the state, deposeth and saith, I was in Gallatin when the Mormons made an attack on it, which took place on one Thursday in October. All the persons that were there left the town, and the Mormons, as I believe them to be the number of about 150 or 200, all armed, took possession of the town, and the store and other houses were burnt, as I learned that evening, and further, this deponent saith not. End quote. So, Raglan was at Gallatin when Captain Fearnot and his 200 Danites descended upon the town and plundered it and chased out any inhabitants that remained. You know, Raglan and his anti-Mormon mobocrats had cut rope and run as soon as the Mormon mob appeared on the horizon. And thanks to Raglan's mob fleeing, the Mormons met with no opposition during their depredations of Daviess County. And the next testimony that we're going to read comes from Andrew J. Job, a man living in Daviess County at the time of the Mormon depredations, and he's a little bit more detailed in here. Quote, Andrew Job, a witness for the state, produced, sworn, and examined, deposeth and saith, while the Mormon troops were in Daviess County in the last expedition, I was taken prisoner by Captain Fearnot, as he was called, who, I have since learned, was a Mr. Patton. While they were getting me into Diamond about midnight, I passed on between Millport and that place, and counted 10 houses on fire. James Rawlins, Ebenezer Page, James Henderson, Allinson Ripley, and Sidney Tanner were of the company that took me prisoner. Just naming more names to ascertain guilt. When the houses were burning, I heard Ebenezer Page say that the mob were burning their own houses and would lay it on the Mormons. I observed it was curious they should burn their own houses. He replied it was, but they were doing so. So that's, okay, so the Mormons, they even claim this today about the Mormon depredations. They say that the houses that they burned and all the property that they looted, it was all just left there, and the houses were empty and whatnot, and the Mobocrats set fire to their own houses just so that they could blame the Mormons for this. Whether or not that happened, it seems highly unlikely. Whether or not that happened, that doesn't seem to play itself out in the rest of the testimonies. The way that it seems from what we are gathering, from the information we've gathered from this court of inquiry and other sources, it sounds more like the Mormons were just burning the houses down. But even this early on, Ebenezer Page was like, yeah, well, the anti-Mormons are burning their own houses. Now, that seems weird. Yeah, but they're still doing it. It's incredible to see that this early on they were already covering their collective ass. It's beautiful. I arrived at Diamond that night a prisoner and was detained there until next morning about daybreak, when Ira Glaze, and William Boone, who were also taken prisoners, were turned loose by Lyman Wright and told that he would give us 4 hours to leave the county, and if they caught us after that time, we should not live any longer. Before we left, I heard Lyman Wright say, "Come, boys, feed your horses and get your breakfast. We must try and scatter the mob." After I left Diamond, I went to my stepmother's and made efforts to get out of the county. After the Mormons surrendered at Diamond to the militia, I went with my stepmother to Diamond to hunt for her property, which had been left at the house when she moved, and which was missing on her return, such as beds, bed clothing, knives and forks, a trunk, etc. On examination, we found at the house of Lyman Wright and upon his bedstead a feather bed, which I knew to be the one left by her at the time she fled from the Mormons. I knew the bed from its appearance. The tick was striped and pieced at the end, and the stripes of the piece turned crosswise. Also, we found in White's house a set of knives and forks, which I knew were the same left at her house as above stated. My stepmother left her residence in 2 miles of Diamond, where she left the above articles on Wednesday before I was taken prisoner, which was on the Sunday night after, and when at Diamond the night I was prisoner, I slept on that same bed as I believed it to be at one Sloan's, as I understood his name to be. When my stepmother left her home near Diamond where the articles were left, she went into the lower part of Davies, to which place I went when turned loose as a prisoner. My father's name is Robert Job, and further this deponent saith not. Signed, Andrew Job. End quote. So, essentially, Andrew Job, who was taken prisoner, said, my stepmother's property was stolen when she was chased out of Davies County by the Mormons, and after the surrender of Diamond in Davies County, he saw those same things that his stepmother owned in the house of Lyman Wright. It's kind of hard to contest that the Mormons didn't loot some of the property when you have a prisoner of war saying, hey, I recognize those forks and knives, I recognize this bed, I recognize everything around here. This used to be my stepmother's stuff. I mean, this is one point that we ascertained that the Mormons did indeed loot the goods, the consecrated goods as they called them, because there were more people than just Andrew Job who went through Diamond and Far West and recognized some of the goods. Like I said, I'm just gathering representative testimonies from the myriad of testimonies from anti-Mormons that were claiming similar things. So, and granted, there are a non-insignificant number of other testimonies from anti-Mormons, okay? And let me take a step back. Anti-Mormons, I don't like that description. It ignores a lot of nuance, but it's useful for our application to today. But as I said at the beginning, for fear of redundancy and boredom, we're only reading a small but representative group of testimonies. And that concludes our reading of anti-Mormon testimonies. And I'm going to tell you right now, the Mormon testimonies are significantly more damning than anything these people who hated the Mormons could tell the court. Let's begin with reading the Mormon testimonies with a Mormon who died in 1876 in Idaho with 4 verifiable wives and 13 children. More or less faithful all of his days in the church. And his name was Morris Phelps, no relation to W.W. William Wines or Double Dub Phelps. He was exactly 3 days older than Joe, and he had joined the church in August of 1831. Okay, this guy Morris Phelps had been a faithful member all his days, never raising any particular ire from the church. His family had been chased from their home in Jackson County in 1833, and he subsequently was called on a mission in 1834. He was a carpenter for the Kirtland Temple and lived in Far West at the time of the surrender. This guy was all in, and his testimony is as follows, quote, Morris Phelps, a witness produced sworn and examined for the state, deposeth and saith that Parley P. Pratt was in the battle with Bogart. Darwin Chase was one of the expedition, but not in the battle. Lyman Gibbs was in the battle, thinks Benjamin Jones was in the battle, and Norman Shear was also and wounded. I was called upon by Charles Searich to go down to Crooked River to help relieve some Mormon prisoners who it was said had been taken by a mob. I first refused to go, but being threatened with force, I consented to go. We proceeded to McDaniel's Field in Ray County, where we were commanded to hitch our horses, and we proceeded down to where Captain Bogart was encamped. Myself in the extreme rear, the fight was brought on, but I was not in it. On our return from the battleground near Log Creek Timber in Caldwell County, we met Joseph Smith Jr., Lyman White, and others, who went to the wounded and pronounced blessings on them and prayed for them to be healed and saved. When we started from McDaniel Field fences, the only command given that I heard was, "Boys, follow me," given by the commander. I have been in 2 Danite meetings. The first I did not make any exception to, and in the second the following exceptionable was inculcated, that we should take spoil or plunder in some cases. But it was objected to, and I have never attended a Danite meeting since. The day before the Mormons went to Adamont-Diomen, Joseph Smith Jr. in an address told an anecdote of a Dutchman who had been appealed to by a captain to purchase potatoes, and Rigdon, in speaking of dissenters who were unwilling to fight mobs, said that they ought to be pitched upon their horses with pitchforks and bayonets and forced into the front of the battle, and their property confiscated to the use of the army. The anecdote spoken above about the Dutchman was told by Smith after Rigdon's address, and without any application of it by him, and further, this deponent saith not. Signed, Morris Phelps. Okay, that was a faithful Mormon's testimony about, the things that have been leading up to this day. And unfortunately, this is the case with every testimony we'll read. The facts discussed in the court of inquiry were largely agreed upon by the Mormons and the Missourians who gave the testimonies. There really wasn't a positive way to describe these acts of war without making the primary actor look responsible for lots of monstrous shit. Even when those acts of war are described by the most inline, brainwashed simpleton. Joe was suffering the wrath of real facts, crushing him, and no amount of alternative facts or crying betrayal was going to alter the reality. So the next one that we're going to read is from John Corrill. He was a faithful Mormon who had been with us for quite a few years, having previously received chastisement from Joe for seemingly many reasons. He'd also won a seat in the Missouri State Legislature thanks to the Mormons' successful brawl at the Gallatin election on August 8th, a couple months prior to this. So some have contended that the election was a bit of a turning point in John Corrill's conduct because he didn't seem quite as gung-ho and faithful at that point. He'd raised various contentions with the leaders about their actions against the Missouri government. Advice which wasn't really heeded or appreciated. Corrill was chastised for giving that advice. So this is his testimony. Quote, John Corrill, A witness produced, sworn and examined in behalf, the state deposeth and saith that about last June I was invited to a private meeting in which an effort was made to adopt some plan to get rid of the dissenters. There were some things I did not like and opposed it with others, and it failed. After that, I met President Rigdon, and he told me that I ought not to have anything to do with it, and that they would do as they pleased. I took his advice. I learned afterwards that they had secret meetings, but I was never invited. None of the first presidency was present at the meeting above referred to. We have a rule in the church authorizing any member to consecrate or give voluntarily his supplies, property to the church for charitable purposes. President Rigdon last summer preached a sermon commonly called the Salt Sermon, which seemed to have for its object to produce a feeling among the people to get rid of the dissenters for crimes alleged and because they disagreed with them. In a few days, there seemed considerable excitement among the people, and the dissenters left. As I addressed them, they were in danger. I was afterwards invited to one of those meetings where an oath in substance, the same testified to by Dr. Avard, was administered. The society was ultimately organized into companies, and captains of 10s and 50s were appointed. I took exceptions to the teachings as to the duties of that society, wherein it was said, if one brother got into any kind of difficulty, it was the duty of the rest to help him out, right or wrong. At the second, or at least the last meeting I attended, the presidency, to wit, Joseph Smith Jr., Hiram Smith, and Sidney Rigdon, and also George Robertson were there. There was, at this meeting, a ceremony of introducing the officers of the society to the presidency, the organization of the Danites, that's what he's talking about, who pronounced blessings on each of them, as introduced according to the faithfulness in their calling, and they should have blessings. After this, President Rigdon got up and made general remarks about the substance as follows, relating the oppressions the society had suffered, and they wanted to be prepared for further events, but said he wished to do nothing unlawful. If the people would let him alone, they would preach the gospel and live in peace. Towards the close, he observed to the people that they should obey the presidency, and if the presidency led them astray, they might destroy them. In the last, or in some public meeting, Joseph Smith Jr. said, if the people would let us alone, we would preach the gospel to them in peace. But if they came on to molest us, we would establish our religion by the sword, and that he would become to this generation a second Muhammad. About April last, I heard Joseph Smith Jr. and President Rigdon, who appeared to be vexed on account of troubles and lawsuits they had, say that they would suffer vexatious lawsuits no longer, that they would resist even an officer in the discharge of his duty. Smith said he has been before court some 20,000 times. They had never found anything against him, and that made him of age, and that he would submit to it no longer. I heard Sidney Rigdon's 4th of July speech. I heard him say he would not suffer people to come unto their streets and abuse them, nor would they suffer vexatious lawsuits. In substance, he further remarked, that neither will we permit any man or set of men to institute vexatious lawsuits against us to cheat us out of our just rights. If they do so, woe be unto them. This Mormon church has been represented as being the little stone spoken of by Daniel, which should roll on and crush all opposition to it, and ultimately should be established as a temporal as well as a spiritual kingdom. These things were to be carried on through the instrumentality of the Danite band, as far as force was necessary. If necessary, they being organized into bands of 10s, 50s, and ready for war, the teachings of that society led them to prohibit the taking of any person against the presidency, so much so that it was dangerous for any man to set up opposition to anything that might be set on foot, and I became afraid to speak my own mind. I objected to the course of Dr. Avard in defiance of this Danite band. I rather thought Joseph Smith Jr. upheld him. I would not allow any objections to him. After the return of the Mormons from Davies, I heard Joseph Smith, in presence of Hiram Smith in a conversation, say that application had been made to the governor, and that they understood that he would give them no assistance, and they were determined to withstand the mob. They were greatly incensed against certain persons in Caldwell and Davies, and said they intended to rid the counties of them, that'd be Raglan and others, and of the mob in the course of that week. This was on Sunday morning, and in the course of that day, instructions were given to meet the next day, meaning Monday, and on Monday, Joseph Smith made a speech and some resolutions were passed purporting that those persons who would not engage in this undertaking this property should be consecrated to the use of those who did engage in this undertaking. On Sunday, Joseph Smith in his discourse spoke of persons taking at sometimes what at other times it would be wrong to take, and gave as an example the case of David eating the shewbread, and also of the Savior and his apostles plucking the ears of corn and eating as they passed through the cornfield. He supposed the prejudices of the Jews and the Pharisees were so great against the Savior that they would give him nothing to eat, and they took that method to get it. On the Monday, when the resolutions above referred to were introduced, President Rigdon in a speech said that those who were unwilling to go to war ought to be put upon their horses with guns and bayonets and forced into the front of the war, having reference to those who heretofore had been backwards in defending themselves and families. No persons were suffered to leave the county in this extreme time, and I met with Phelps to consult as to what all ought to do. After the troops got to Diamond, in all about 400 or 500 men, I heard Lyman White addressing a portion of the men who were then perhaps 8 or 10, that the earth was the Lord's, and the fullness thereof with the cattle upon the 1,000 hills. And if I was hungry, I would not tell you that the saints of the Lord had the same privilege or rights. After that, perhaps, the next day, I saw a drove of some 4 or 5 cattle pass along, and asked what cattle these were, and was answered that they were drove of buffalo. They were called buffalo instead of cattle. Others observed that they were cattle of Methodist priests had consecrated. Joseph Smith Jr., Hiram Smith, Parley P. Pratt, Lyman White, George Robinson, a bunch of other names, were in the expedition that went to Davies County. At the time, Gallatin was burned on the same day that the company went to Gallatin. Lyman White went with the company to Millport. As I understand, he returned and made a report, as I understood it to be to Joseph Smith Jr., in which he said he found nothing to fight but fences and empty houses. And then, of course, he burned them. I understood him to say that people had not taken away all their property. Smith, the prophet, here asked him if they had taken the Negroes. He said, yes. Someone then laughed, observed, Smith, you have lost your Negro, to which I think he made no reply. We covered that last episode. Joseph Smith asked White if he had done anything with the property remaining in Millport. White said not, that they would leave the matter for the private council. Gibbs told me he went down with the expedition that fought Bogart, and he remained behind 3/4 of a mile from the battleground, holding horses. I feel confident that Isaac Morley was not in the fight with Bogart. I think the original object of the Danite band was to operate on the dissenters, but afterwards it grew into a system to carry out the designs of the presidency, and if necessary, to use physical force to upbuild the kingdom of God. It was done by them, this is my opinion, as to their object, and I learned it from various sources connected with that band. It was my understanding that Dr. Avard teachings in the Danite Society proceeded from the presidency. I never heard that constitution spoken of by Dr. Avard in the society when I was president, nor did I ever hear of it until lately, and further, this deponent saith not. Signed, John Correll. So, Correll, afterwards, he kind of felt the wrath of what this testimony did, because he let us in on a number of details that were only suspected after they had heard Avard's testimony. When you have this many people who are giving independent testimonies of these occurrences and these military actions taken by the church, it's really hard to ignore them, right? I mean, when you have all of these testimonies combined together in the aggregate, it's really easy to say that the Mormons were acting in a military capacity, especially with the Danites. But, I mean, John Corrill was a faithful Mormon at that time that he gave this. Only after this was he excommunicated. But faithful Mormon after faithful Mormon took the stand and shed increasingly more light upon the Danite situation and the Mormon depredations. And the old adage comes to mind, no good deed goes unpunished, because not only Corrill, but a large number of the people who were considered faithful Mormons were testifying on the stand before Joe went to Liberty Jail, were excommunicated promptly upon his escape in the spring of 1839. And John Corrill was one of those who testified his way onto Joe's hit list, and his testimony and subsequent excommunication is well remembered and revered by scholars like Richard Bushman as a strong and trustworthy account of the Mormon War in Missouri. So the next excerpt that we're going to read is the last half of James Owen's testimony. Now, he was a faithful Mormon, having been baptized in June of 1831 after his 11-year-old son heard the gospel and was baptized a few months prior. He lived and was chased out of Jackson County and was living in Far West at the time of the surrender. There's nothing to suggest that James Owens ever questioned Joe or the leadership, or the church for that matter. He died as a faithful Mormon. Quote, he, meaning Joseph Smith, further stated that they pretended to come out as a militia, that's Bogart's troops, but that they were all a damned set of mobs. He stated at that or some other time that as they had commenced consecrating in Daviess County, that he intended to have the surrounding counties consecrated to him, that the time had come when the riches of the Gentiles should be consecrated to the saints. While the last of the expedition was in progress in Daviess County, a portion of the troops returned to Far West, to whom and to the people assembled I understood Sidney Rigdon had read a letter from Joseph Smith, Jr. I asked him to read it to me, which he did, and it was, as near as I can recollect, as follows, that the enemy was delivered into their hands, and that they need not fear, that this had been given to him by the spirit of prophecy in the name of Jesus Christ. Sidney Rigdon appeared to rejoice at the information, and give unto the thing. A few days before the militia got to Far West, Joseph Smith observed that he did not intend to obey the laws any longer, and he had a great many writs served on him, and that he was of age, and did not intend to have another served on him. And further, this deponent saith not. Signed, James C. Owens. So, to comment on his testimony specifically, James Owens claims that Joseph gave a revelation and in the form of a letter and sent it to Sidney Rigdon. And now they were corresponding every day at the right before the surrender. Rigdon and Joe were. But this revelation said that apparently the enemy was delivered into the Mormons' hands and that they need not fear. And when Rigdon saw this, he rejoiced, because I think Rigdon believed that Joe was a conduit to God. I think Rigdon totally bought into Joe's revelations as being legitimate. And in this case, you know, this is a powerful revelation. If your prophet says that you're going to be okay, you know, it's really hard to not rejoice something like that when you have militia surrounding your town, you know? But, you know, James Owens was a faithful Mormon, and he was giving these details that are frowned upon. I mean, these are detailing the military actions of the Mormons and talking about the consecrated property that the Mormons looted from the Gentiles. You know, the riches of the Gentiles should be consecrated to the saints. You know, this isn't much like that old school type mafia situation, you know, where like snitches get stitches, or, you know, a bullet for that matter. Many of these Mormon witnesses had been sworn to secrecy under the Danite oath, or were just threatened with their lives as dissenters or apostates if they questioned or didn't participate in the Mormons' cause. But nobody was paying them hush money at this point. Joe and Rigdon didn't have any more power over their lives, you know, any more so than the state did, because everybody was in shackles in the courtroom. As soon as every threat and incentive to keep their mouth shut was removed, these good Mormon people squealed like mashed cats. They weren't obfuscating truth or hiding incriminating facts. They were just telling the sequence of events as they had experienced it from their own first-person perspectives. So before reading the next one, I just want to point out how nice it is that we have these court documents well preserved, and the majority of them are uploaded online. If not for this court of inquiry, it may have been a bit harder to recreate the series of events that led to the Mormons' surrender. But instead, we have all of these first-hand accounts sworn in court testimonials and all of the accompanying letters and military orders and exchanges. That's not to say that this whole thing turned out fair. I mean, such a claim is absurd, but the fact that we have these surviving documents makes a powerful argument for the usefulness of the court system. You know, in the town square after that sham court-martial, the day after the surrender, you know, none of these documents ever would have come forward. And the history of what happened to Joe and the Mormons would have been forever shrouded in mystery or painstakingly recreated after decades or centuries of historical study and document gathering. You know, I'll just say, as unfair as this presentation is for the Mormons, and the fact that they didn't have any legal representation in here, just goes to show how useful it is when things are done somewhat by the books. Historians have access to all of these documents verified and uploaded online. I mean, we can all read these documents. You know, it's helpful to see history with such a verifiably black and white perspective this way. You know, and that's the point of reading these different first-hand accounts, because it's like that movie Vantage Point from, you know, early in the 2000s, whenever that came out, I can't remember, maybe 2008 or something. You know, they showed this one event, but they went through it from different people's perspectives. So you're watching this event and how each different person saw it. Well, we're covering right now everything that we've discussed in like the last 9 historical episodes, but we're just like vantage pointing it, seeing it from everybody's different perspective. And, you know, it shows us that like these were really people that were going through this. It wasn't just the Mormons and the anti-Mormons. They weren't just these monolithic groups of people that were fundamentally opposed to each other. They were, you know, these groups were made up of constituent singular persons. And those persons each had their own lives and their own things to deal with and their own perspectives of the conflict. Each of them attended different meetings and saw different leaders say different things. But all of these things combined together in the aggregate really don't leave a lot of question as to what the Mormon leadership actually did and the fault that they bear in this conflict. So the next testimony that we're going to read comes from Reed Peck. Now, Reed Peck was a faithful Mormon at the time of the surrender, and we're going to read a chunk from his infamous Reed Peck manuscript at the end of the show. Essentially, though, Peck's 1839 manuscript became the go-to authority on the happenings surrounding the Mormons in Missouri until these court documents were published and widely consumed in 1841. And here is Peck's recreation of the events when he was up on the stand. Quote, Reed Peck, a witness produced sworn and examined on behalf of the state, deposeth and saith, a short time after Cowdery and the Whitmers left Far West, sometime in June, after the Danite Manifesto, that's my own adding, George Robinson and Philo Dibble, oh, there's good old Dibble Dabble, we haven't seen him forever, invited me to a Danite meeting. I went. The only speaker was Dr. Avard, that's Samson Avard, who explained the object of the meeting and said that its object was that we might be perfectly organized to defend ourselves against the mobs, that we were all to be governed by the presidency and do whatever they required and uphold them, that we were not to judge for ourselves whether it were right or wrong, that God had raised us a prophet who would judge for us, and that it was proper we should stand by each other in all cases. And he gave us an example. If we found one of the Danites in any difficulty, in Ray or Clay, for instance, we should rescue him if we had to do with his adversary, as Moses did with the Egyptian, put him in the sand. It made no difference whether the Danite was to blame or not. They would track to Far West and there be taken care of. The question was asked whether it would extend to a legal process. Avard answered not. So that's Danite leader Avard preaching, no matter what happens, we do not leave a Danite behind. And then somebody asked, well, is that going to go to legal processes as well? And Avard just kept silent. He didn't answer. Because as we're seeing in this court testimony, that's not true. Like, he didn't have an answer to that, right? So the Mormons, okay, so I guess it is essentially true. The Mormons never really left a Danite behind, except for the dead one at the Battle of Crooked River. They went back and got his body afterwards. But, you know, the entire battle at Crooked River was because a couple of Mormons were captured. And the Danites marched because they had this idea that Danites stand with Danites, whether they're in the right or wrong. And now they're suffering the legal repercussions of that. I mean, yeah, Crips and Bloods here. The Danite oath was administered to about 30 or 40 persons at this meeting. Philo Dibble told me who the head officers of the Danites were, that George Robertson was colonel, that he, Dibble, was lieutenant colonel, and Seymour Brunson was major, that I was chosen adjutant. After that, I had a talk with George Robinson and Philo Dibble together, in which I was informed who the officers were as above, and further that Jared Carter was captain general of the band, and Cornelius P. Lott, major general, and Samson Avard, brigadier general. This is as I now recollect it. Dr. Avard, in speaking to the society, remarked that it would be impossible for the presidency to explain the object of the society to every member, but that the presidency would explain their views or wishes to the head officers, and they to the members of the society. That's tactical, right? You have to do that. I was present at one meeting where the officers of the society were presented and introduced to the presidency, each office receiving a blessing from them. Avard stated that he had procured the presidency to come there to show the society that what he was doing was according to their direction or will. And while there, the presidency approved of Avard's course in the society. Dr. Avard, however, did not explain to the presidency what his teachings had been in the society. I heard Avard on one occasion say that the Danites were to consecrate their surplus property and to come in by tens to do so. And if they lied about it, he said Peter killed Ananias and Sapphira, and that would be an example for us. When appointed adjutant of the Danite band as referred to above, I did not think proper to object openly, though I determined within myself not to act. And the lists and other papers brought to me for recording, I threw aside and made no record of. On the day before the last expedition to Davies, I heard Joseph Smith in a speech say in reference to stealing that in a general way he did not approve of it, but that on one occasion our Savior and his disciples stole corn in passing through the cornfields for the reason they could not otherwise procure anything to eat. He told an anecdote of a Dutchman's potatoes and said in substance that a colonel or captain was quartered near a Dutchman from whom he wished to purchase some potatoes, who refused to sell them. The officer then charged his men not to be caught stealing the Dutchman's potatoes, but next morning he found his potatoes all dug. I think this was in reference to the expedition to Davies, and that they had been compelled to go out there so often that the people there ought to bear the expense. Such men as would oppose things undertaken as being unlawful, and such as they feared was a violation of the law. I heard Smith and Rigdon in their public address denominate "Oh, don't men." Those are the "oh, don't men" that Rigdon said they're going to be put on their horses with pitchforks. Oh, don't men. These I understood to be those who were denominated also dissenters, and in reference to men who were hanging back and did not wish to engage in their expeditions, they were called traitors. And referring to such, as I understood, Mr. Rigdon proposed that their blood should first begin to flow in the streets of Far West. But his proposition did not carry. The proposition was then made and carried unanimously that those who hung back should be pitched up on their horses and made to go and placed in front of the battle. All the above occurred in Far West, the day before the last expedition to Davies. The following of the defendants were in the last expedition to Davies County, and then it lists a bunch of people that he remembers being there. Then he goes on to say, when the troops arrived at Diamond, they were divided into companies of 20, 40, and 50, just as they might be called for. Those companies were sent out in different parts of the county, as I saw them thus occasionally going out and coming in. I saw a company of about 50 called a fur company come once. Some had one thing and some another. One I saw with a feather bed, another had some spun yarn. I understand from some of those who were bringing property that they were to take it to the bishop's store and deposit it, and if they failed to do so, it would be considered stealing. Yeah, you're stealing from the stealers. Nice. As the property was brought there, it was a general shout of hurrah and waving of hats by those in camp. I heard Dimmick Huntington, one of the troops, tell in camp that the mob had burned the storehouse in Gallatin, but that the Mormons, as though I did not believe it. And he stooped down to me, being on his horse, and whispered to me that it was Captain Brunson who had gone with 20 men to the Grindstone Fork who was burning those houses. The goods taken in Gallatin was generally understood in camp to have been deposited with the bishop as consecrated property. When the companies would return from their expedition, they would make their reports to the presidency, who were there, as this company above referred to as the Fur Company, passed with their plunder. I heard Mahlon Johnson, who lived in the lower part of Caldwell, ask Joseph Smith if these proceedings would not endanger the families living in that part of Caldwell and incite the people to come on them. That's a relevant question, and Smith asked him what he was talking about. That this was the first step they had ever taken to quell the mob. I heard Perry Keyes, one who was engaged in the depredations in Davies, say that Joseph Smith remarked in his presence that it was his intention after they got through Davies to go down and take the store in Carrollton. This remark Smith made while in Davies. After the Mormon troops returned to Diamond far west from Davies, I saw several of the captains of tens who had been in that expedition making out a list of their men for that purpose, as they said, of being handed in that they might receive their portion of the spoils. That's relevant, right? If people participated in the depredations, then they got a cut of the goods that they stole. It's amazing. I heard Darwin Chase say that he was in the expedition against a Bogart. All right, Battle of Crooked River here. Several days before the militia came to Far West, I learned through Mr. Arthur of Clay County that they were raising the militia. On Monday, after the militia arrived, I went out toward Crooked River to see if I could meet them. I met a young man who informed me that General Doniphan was on Crooked River with the militia. I returned to Far West and informed Mr. Rigdon and Joseph Smith, as well as giving general information of the fact. I proposed to Mr. Smith to go the next morning and try to find them, to which he assented. He continues on, I was disappointed in my effort, and returned late in the evening to Far West. Just as I arrived, I saw the militia and went down to them with a flag. I met with General Doniphan, who received me, and told me there were about 1,300 in number, that they were militia. On my return to town, I met with Joseph Jr. and informed them that the troops were under General Doniphan's command, as I then supposed was the case. Mr. Smith asked me their number, and when I told him, he replied to keep good courage. We can whip that number if they make an attack upon us. Some other person came up at the time and inquired of me their number, and Mr. Smith answered that Mr. Phelps, who was a judge of numbers having seen troops before, said there was about 250. As he was supposed, Mr. George Robinson then whispered to me to not tell the men the number of the militia, that it would frighten them or damp their courage. I mean, this is talking about the, right prior to the surrender of Far West and Diamond. Reed Peck went and met with General Doniphan, and Doniphan said, there are 1,300 men here, but William Wines Phelps, I assume, maybe it was Morris Phelps, said that, yeah, there's only 250 men out there. Don't worry, guys. Don't worry. Oh, yeah. Reed, Mr. Peck, don't tell anybody what you know, because that's going to scare them. I mean, this is just everything bad that possibly could have happened was happening. Nothing was going well. The court document continues. At this stage of the examination of Reed Peck, the following named defendants, King Follett, Samuel Bent, Ebury Brown, William Whitman, and Jonathan Dunham, were brought to the bar of the court and put upon this trial for the offenses alleged against the other defendants, and time being allowed to them to employ counsel, they retired and again returned to the bar, appearing by their counsel. Messrs. Reese and Doniphan, the examination of Reed Peck was then continued. Reed Peck deposeth and further saith that Jonathan Dunham was in the last expedition to Davies County and was captain of the company of 50, which I have spoke of as called the Fur Company. He went under the fictitious name of Captain Blackhawk. When the men were paraded, they were called out as belonging to Captain Blackhawk's company. My impression is that King Follett was not in that expedition, but he was a captain of 12 men in Far West under the Danite Order, as I understood, as he was neither an officer or private of the militia, and was known and called under the fictitious name of Captain Bull, and by company was called the Regulators. You got the Fur Company led by Captain Blackhawk, and the Regulators led by Captain Bull. I mean, they were pretty good with their nicknames, at least. I saw William Whitman on the expedition to Davies, and seemed to be one of the troops engaged with others, sometime previous to the difficulties in Davies. The first time when the militia went out there for the purpose of keeping the peace, I heard Joseph Smith in a public address say that he had a reverence for the Constitution of the United States and of this state, but as for the laws of this state, he did not intend to regard them nor care anything about them. As they were made by lawyers and blacklegs, the above things said sometime in the last July or August. On the eve of the last expedition to Davies, I heard Joseph Smith say that they, meaning the heads of the church, had appealed to the government for protection, that he had sent us back word that we must fight our own battles. He further stated that the law was unequally administered, all against us and none for us, and spoke of the prosecution set on foot in Davies as an instance. And he then said we must take our own cause in our own hands and defend ourselves, that he did not calculate to regard the laws any longer. I think, and was in the last end of June or the 1st of July last, that I heard Dr. Avard say that he had just returned from council with the presidency, in which council Jared Carter was broken of his office as Captain General of the Danite Band for having spoken against Sidney Rigdon. So that's why Jared Carter was removed as the head of the Danites and replaced by Elias Higbee. Interesting. One of the presidency, it being a regulation of that society that no one should speak against them or hear anyone else do it with impunity. In that council, Avard said an arrangement was made to dispose of the dissenters to wit. Now this is the arrangement and the way that Avard would dispose of anybody that's dissenting against the church. That all the head offices of the Danite Band should have a list of the dissenters both here and in Kirtland. And said he, I will tell you how I will do with them when I meet one damning the presidency. I can damn them as well as he. And if he wanted to drink, he would get a bowl of brandy and get them half drunk. And taking him by the arm, he would take him to the woods or brush and said he would be into their guts in a minute and put them under sod. Wow. That is how Avard is going to deal with any dissenters. He gave this as an example of the way they should be disposed of. The only motives for getting rid of the dissenters in this way, as far as I ever learned, was this. If they remained among the Mormons, they would introduce a class there that would ultimately endanger their lives and destroy the church. And if they were suffered to go out from among them, they would be telling lies on them in the surrounding country. These reasons I gathered from Mr. Rigdon's salt sermon, and Mr. Rigdon said in the same sermon that he would assist to erect a gallows on the square and hang them all. Joseph Smith was president and followed Mr. Rigdon after he also made the above declaration and said he did not wish to do anything unlawful. He then spoke of the fate of Judas and said that Peter had hung him, meaning Peter hung Judas, and said that he approved of Mr. Rigdon's sermon and called it a good sermon. And further, this deponent saith not. Signed, Reed Peck. End quote. Reed Peck really gave us the inside track on a lot of the closed door meetings there. You know, he'd been an active devil's advocate against Joe with the Danite depredations, but his advice was not heeded, and Peck, among many others, was chastised for his wise dissent. Peck didn't take too well to being labeled a dissenter or a traitor, especially when the rhetoric against dissenters and traitors was unequivocally death. So that's when he ended up writing his manuscript. And here's a brief paragraph from near the end of the manuscript so you can get a sense of kind of the tone for the rest of the manuscript. and there is a link for the Repeck manuscript in the show notes. Quote, I intended to take a course that would save a great number from misery, whether guilty or innocent, knowing that the guilty had been made so by placing too much confidence in the divine authority of their leaders. Right. Believing that God would shield them from harm and prevent the consequences that would naturally flow from their conduct. I did them a service, but still the sacrifice of my character is necessary to support one of more importance. I've been informed that the army were generally acquainted with the course pursued by John Corrill, myself, and some others for 6 months preceding the war. Those are the dissenters. Therefore, no one can accuse us of cowardice, for we knew that our innocence among men secure our safety. End quote. Peck hit the nail on the head. He said it perfectly. The guilt had been made so by placing too much confidence in the divine authority of their leaders. Obviously writing this from an already embraced us and them perspective of the Mormons. He doesn't say us when referring to the Mormons. He refers to them as the Mormons, seemingly drawing a more distinct line between him and them than had existed prior to 1839 when he published this manuscript. Given everything that happened, though, I can't fault him for his dissent and subsequent disbelief. In fact, he should be commended for it. He dealt with a lot of public disgrace because of his opposition to Joe's shenanigans during this whole 1838 Mormon War fiasco. But he essentially stayed a strong member throughout. And finally, after the surrender, which flew in the face of everything Joe and Rigdon had been preaching, Peck realized, oh, well, maybe I'm the one who's getting duped here. You know, it's nice to see the veil fall from somebody's eyes and make that realization right in front of us in a relatively short historical time frame. But Peck, as he said in naming John Corrill, obviously wasn't the only Mormon who defected and testified, as we're well aware by this point. Let's get into another testimony, this one being from somebody who had recently fallen away thanks to the Kirtland Safety Society anti-banking company fiasco, but was permitted to remain in Far West under a watchful eye. William Wines Phelps, as we call him Double Dub Phelps, who'd been one of those people included in the Danite Manifesto as told to leave from Far West or die along with Cowdery and the Whitmers, was also one of the primary negotiators of the surrender terms on behalf of the Mormons. So Double Dub Phelps had been a member of the church since June of 1831 and was the primary printer in Independence, Missouri before the printing press was burned and the Saints were chased out in 1833. Phelps was essentially one of the main leaders of the church in Missouri throughout all of the Kirtland years, and now it was his turn to tell his perspective of the sequence of events. Quote, William Wines Phelps, a witness on the part of the state produced, sworn, and examined, deposeth and saith that as early as April last, at a meeting in Far West of 9 or 12 persons, Mr. Rigdon arose and made an address to them in which he spoke of having borne persecutions and lawsuits and other privations and did not intend to be a victim any longer. That's April that he's talking about that going on. That they meant to resist the law, and if a sheriff came after them with his writs, they would kill him, and if anybody opposed them, they would take off their heads. George Harris, who was present, observed, "You mean the heads of their influence, I suppose?" Rigdon answered he meant that lump of flesh and bones called the skull or scalp. Yeah, that's Rigdon right there. Good old bloody hinge-pin Rigdon, I guess. Joe Smith Jr. followed Mr. Rigdon, approving his sentiments, and said that was what they intended to do. Both in their remarks observed that they meant to have the words of the presidency to be as good and as undisputed as the words of God, and that no one should speak against what they said. Hiram Smith was not in Far West at this time, and think he was not in the country. Sometime in June, steps were taken to get myself and others out of the county of Caldwell, and efforts were made to get the post office from me, being postmaster, by a demand for it. I explained the law, which seemed satisfactory, and it was given up. I then informed the presidency of the church by letter that I was willing to do anything that was right if I had wronged any man. I would make satisfaction. I was then notified to attend a meeting. Sidney Rigdon, in an address, again brought up the subject of the post office. I told them if public opinion said I should give it up, I would do so, but they would have to wait the decision of the Postmaster General, which they agreed to, with the understanding that a committee of 3 should inspect the letters written and sent by me, as well as those received by me. This committee, however, never made their appearance. After my case was disposed of, another man's was taken up. So, what happened with Double Dub Phelps here? He was postmaster, so he couldn't be chased out with the Danite Manifesto, even though he was listed as, the Whitmers and Cowdery and Double Dubs here. They were all told to get out. They had 24 hours to get out, essentially. And he couldn't because he was postmaster of Far West. So he said, I'll give up my office if I've done something wrong, but we have to await the decision of the Postmaster General in order to appoint somebody new to the position. So then the Mormons said, well, you're stealing our letters and you're making it so our mail isn't getting to and from places. And we're going to set up a committee to monitor what you're doing. And the committee never made an appearance because another issue was taken up. So this is what the other issue is. I mean, it's a convoluted situation with Double Dub Phelps because he was a faithful member of the church, but then he was labeled as a dissenter in June and they couldn't get rid of him. They couldn't kill him. They couldn't remove him forcefully like they had Cowdery and the Whitmers. They couldn't do anything about Double Dub. So they were just fighting him as quasi-legally as they possibly could. So now this is the other man's situation. He attempted to speak in his defense and said he was a Republican. Several rushed up towards him and stopped him, telling him if he had anything to say in favor of the presidency, he might say it, and that was their Republicanism. Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, and Hyrum Smith, who composed the first presidency, were there. It was observed in the meeting that if any person spoke against the presidency, they would hand him over into the hands of the brother of Gideon, which was later called the Danites. I knew not at the time who or what it meant. Shortly after that, I was at another meeting where they were trying several, the first presidency being present. Sidney Rigdon was chief spokesman. The object of the meeting seemed to be to make persons confess and repent of their sins to God and the presidency and arraign them for giving false accounts of their money and effects they had on hand. And they said whenever they found one guilty of these things, they were to be handed over to the brother of Gideon. That was their solution for everything. Brother of Gideon, I'll take care of him. Several were found guilty and handed over as they said. I yet did not know what was meant by this expression, the brother of Gideon. Not a great while after this, private meetings were held. I endeavored to find out what they were, and I learned from John Correll and others they were forming a secret society called Danites, formerly called the Brother of Gideon. In the meeting above referred to, in which I was present, one man arose to defend himself, and he was ordered to leave the house, but commenced to speak. Avard then said, "Where are my 10 men?" 30 or more men arose up, whereupon the man said he would leave the house. Wow, that's intimidation at its finest. At this meeting, I agreed to conform to the order of the church in all things, knowing I had a good deal of property in the county, and if I went off, I should leave it. For some time before and after this meeting, an armed guard was kept in town, and one of them at my house, during the night, as I supposed, to watch my person. Wow, they had an armed Danite guard outside of Double Dub Phelps' house because they weren't sure what he was gonna do. I mean, wow. This is, this theocracy is really coming to fruition right in front of our eyes here. In the forepart of July, I, being one of the justices of the county court, was forbid by Joseph Smith from issuing any processes against him. I learned from the clerk of the circuit court that declaration had been filed against Smith, Rigdon, and others by Johnson, and in reference to that case, Smith told Clemenson, the clerk, that he should not issue a writ against him. I observed to Mr. Smith that there was a legal objection to issuing it, that the cost, meaning the clerk's fee, had not been paid. Smith replied, he did not care for that. He did not intend to have any writ issued against him in the county. These things, together with many other, alarmed me for the situation of our county, and at our next circuit court I mentioned these things to the judge and several members of the bar. A few days before the 4th of July last, I heard David Patton, known by the fictitious name of Captain Fearnot, say that Rigdon was writing a declaration to declare the church independent of the United States. That's what he's saying there. I remarked to him, I thought such a thing treasonable to set up a government within a government. He answered, it would not be treasonable if they could maintain it or fight till they died. I mean, that's sound logic, but it's just insane. I mean, Rigdon is going to declare the church independent, and he said that it's going to remain not treasonable as long as we can maintain it, or we're going to fight it till our death. And even then, I guess, I mean, they're labeled as treasonable, but he's still, like, this is the nuclear option. That's what Rigdon was doing. The nuclear option version of seceding from the Union, essentially. It's incredible. It continues, Dimming Huntington and others made about the same remark. Sidney Rigdon's 4th of July oration was the declaration referred to. Along through the summer and fall, a storm appeared to be gathering, and from time to time I went out into Ray and Clay counties, saw and conversed with many gentlemen on the subject who always assured me that they would use every assertion that the law should be enforced, and I repeatedly made these things known in Caldwell County, and that there were no disposition among the people to raise mobs against them from these counties. I never was invited, nor did I attend any of their secret meetings. I was at the meeting the Monday before the last expedition to Davies, having learned that steps would be taken there which might affect me. At this meeting, the presidency, together with many others, were there to the number of perhaps 200 or 300 more. Joseph Smith, I think it was, who addressed the meeting and said in substance that there were others about to go war in Davies County, that those persons who had not returned out their property should be taken to maintain the war. This was by way of formal resolution and was not objected to by any present. A motion was then made by Sidney Rigdon that the blood of those who were thus backwards should first be spilt in the streets of Far West. A few said amen to this, but immediately Joseph Smith, before Rigdon's motion was put, rose and moved that they be taken out into Davies County, and if they came to battle, they should be put on their horses with bayonets and pitchforks and put in front. This passed without a dissenting voice. There was a short made then by Joseph Smith about carrying on the war, in which he said it was necessary to have something to live on. And when they went out to war, it was necessary to take spoils to live on. Yeah, because they didn't have any way to sustain the armies. I mean, the majority of the Mormons were starving. Now they're going to, sustain the army of Israel with no staples? I mean, yeah, of course, that they had no other option. This was in reference to the dissenters as well as to the people of Davis, where they going in speech, he told the anecdote of the Dutchman's potatoes. Finding I should have to go and not wishing to be put in front of the battle, I sought a situation and went out with my wagon. This was the expedition in which Gallatin and Millport were burnt. I went on to Diamond a few days after the Mormon troops had gone out. I went to the tavern late at night when I found Joseph Smith, Hiram Smith, and others. I informed Joseph Smith that the Clay troops had returned home, some 40 or 50 in number, but told him that General Parks was in Far West and his troops just behind. There was a conversation among them as to what they would do, and they came to the conclusion to send down Lyman White at his house for him to send an express to General Parks that his troops were not needed. Some time before day, I awoke and found Lyman White and Captain Fearnot in the house. He said he had sent the express to General Parks, informing him that his militia was not needed. White asked Smith twice if he had arms to the point now to resist the law, that he wanted that matter now distinctly understood. He said he had succeeded in smoothing the matter over with Judge King when he was out, that he had defied the U.S. to take him, but that he had submitted to be taken because he, Smith, had done so. This was in reference to the examination for the offense for which he and Smith had been brought before Judge King in Davies. That's Lyman White and Joe on Raglan's farm in September. Smith replied the time had come when he should resist all law. In the foregoing part of the night after my arrival, I heard a good deal of conversation about driving out the mob from Davies. I heard Joseph Smith remark, there was a store at Gallatin and a grocery at Millport, and in the morning after the conversation between Smith and White about resisting the law, a plan of operations was agreed on, which that Captain Fearnought, who was president, should take a company of 100 men or more and go to Gallatin and take it that day, to take the goods out of the store of Gallatin, bring them to Diamond, and burn the store. Lyman White was to take a company to go to Millport on the same day, and Seymour Brunson was to take a company and go to the Grindstone Fort at the same time. This arrangement was made in the house before day while I was lying on the floor. When I arose in the morning, some of the companies were gone. But I saw Lyman White parade a horse company and start off with it toward Millport. I also saw a foot company the same day go off on the same day. In the evening, I saw both these companies return. The foot company had some plunder which appeared to be feed and bedclothes, etc. They passed on towards the bishop's store, but I know not what they did with the plunder. I remained in the camp 1 day and 2 nights at Diamond, when I returned to Far West. The night before I started to Far West, an express was sent from Joseph Smith and Lyman White to Rigdon at Far West, but what was the contents of the express I know not. When I returned to Far West, I had a message in the reference to having wood and provisions provided for the families of those persons living in Far West who were in Davies, and for the purpose of giving them that information. I was invited to a schoolhouse where it was said that the people had assembled. I went there and was admitted. The men being paraded before the door when I arrived in number about 40 or 50. It was remarked that these were tried men, and we all marched into the house. A guard was placed around the house and one at the door. Mr. Rigdon then commenced making covenants with uplifted hands. The first was that if any man attempted to move out of the country or pack their things for that purpose, that any man then in this house, seeing this without saying anything to any person, should kill him and haul him aside into the brush, and that all the burial he should have should be in a turkey buzzard's gut, so that nothing should be left of him but his bones. That measure was carried in form of a covenant with uplifted hands. After the vote had passed, he said, now, see if anyone dares a vote against it, and called for the negative vote, and there was none. The next covenant, that if any person from the surrounding country came into their town walking about no odds who he might be, any one of other meeting should kill him and throw him aside into the brush. This passed in manner as the above had passed. The third covenant was conceal all these things. So these are the 3 covenants that William Mines Phelps was telling us about here. The first one was, if there's anybody in that meeting house that speaks against this, kill them. The second one, if there's anybody walking around that's a mobocrat, that's walking around Far West or Diamond, kill them. The third of that, these are all secrets, you conceal them, never to reveal them, or you hold your life in forfeiture. Those are the 3 covenants that Mr. Rigdon supposedly made here, or Samson of Vard, or whoever. If there's a little bit of dispute who made these covenants and who called for them, but I think it's fairly certain to say that these covenants were made, and this was all part of the Danite Constitution. It's incredible. The third covenant, blah, blah, blah. Mr. Rigdon then observed that the kingdom of heaven had no secrets, that yesterday a man had stopped his wind and was dragged into the hazel brush, and said he, the man who lisps it shall die. There were several companies organized at this meeting and volunteers called for, and I, having assigned the command of the express company, called for volunteers wanting to be doing something to make a show. Amasa Lyman, a deputy, was in that meeting, and was appointed by Mr. Rigdon captain of a company whose duty it was to watch the movements of the enemy or mob in Buncombe County. And if they burnt one house in Caldwell, his company was to burn 4 of theirs. and men were selected who were strangers in the community, where they were to act toward the latter part of the instructions to Lyman's company. Rigdon observed that if the inhabitants in the surrounding country commenced burning houses in Caldwell, if they could not get clear of them in any other way, they would poison them off. Poison them off. Poison. That is Sidney Rigdon calling for poisoning people, mass poisoning anybody that opposes them. This last remark I did not understand as being particularly addressed to Lyman as a part of the duty of his company, but seemed addressed to the meeting generally. This meeting was on Saturday, and on the next Monday I returned to Diamond with 7 or 8 wagons, 3 of which were moving some families, though I had been directed to take to Diamond for use there. I arrived at Diamond that evening, and next morning 4 of the wagons were loaded and sent back to Far West. Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith perhaps informed me they wanted 4 wagons, a part of which were to haul beef and pork to Far West, and what the balance of loading was, I did not know. But these wagons brought out by me were pointed out and taken back to Far West. I remained in the camps at Diamond that day. My wagon and another went down to Millport and brought up Slade's goods, which were there. Slade is not a Mormon, but has 3 brothers residing in or about Far West who are Mormons. The following of the defendants were in the last expedition to Davies. Then he lists off a bunch of people, inculcating them by association or saying that these people participated. Blah, blah, blah. He says the names. While in Adam on Diamond, I saw George Robinson with a clock under his arm, which afterwards I saw in Far West, and which was claimed by a Mr. McLaney of Davies County as his property, after the arrival of General Clark at Far West. And further, this deponent saith not. Signed, W. W. Phelps. End quote. That was a long one, but William Wines Phelps is an incredible person in Mormon history. Absolutely astonishing for many reasons. We've discussed him a little bit in the past. He was the guy that got screwed over by Joe's Kirtland Safety Society. Joe bought some plots of land and then he tried to sell them back to Double Dub Phelps at an exorbitant profit, and just an incredibly underhanded business deal. He was having problems with the church. He didn't like the whole Fanny Alger incident. He didn't like a lot of what was going on. But resulting from that, he was supposed to be chased out along with Whitmer and the Cowderies with the Danite Manifesto. He couldn't because he was postmaster. We went over this a little bit, but he stuck around and he essentially reconciled his problems with the church and continued to believe in it. And later was refellowshipped and reinstated into the church. And I believe he died in Utah. So, Phelps was a hardcore believing member of the church. He had his disagreements, as did John Corll and, a few of the other people that we've read from, and many others that were existing at the time. But somehow he was still able to reconcile his beliefs and continue working for the church. It's really incredible to see somebody who is able to do that, who doesn't, I don't know if he had any trouble sleeping at night because I don't know. Maybe we'll get into this a little bit in the conclusion here. We only have 1 or 2 more testimonies to read, if I'm not mistaken, but, 1 more testimony and a letter. But the level of belief that these people had and the lengths to which they were willing to go in the face of that belief is just absolutely astonishing. And Phelps is the same, Double Dub Phelps. He's been an important member of our timeline for a good long while, and he will continue to play a part in the development of the church through the Nauvoo years and into Utah. So, interesting guy. Really fascinating stuff. Okay, so the next testimony, and this is actually the last testimony we're going to read. It's been a kind of a grind, I know, but this is from Burr Riggs. He's a man who joined the church in 1831, and he was called on a mission in January of 1832 in Amherst, Ohio. Now, Burr Riggs was an interesting fellow, kind of charismatic and also a little bit crazy. He was known for, like, hanging himself and being taken down so he can have revelations, or bashing his head against the wall to try and incite personal revelations. But, whatever you gotta do to get yourself there. Am I right? Quote, Burr Riggs, a witness for the state, produced, sworn, and examined, deposeth, and saith, in the latter part of June last, immediately after the witness and Cowdery left Far West, I fell into company with Joseph Smith and George Robinson. Joseph Smith said there were certain men using their influence against the proceedings of this presidency, and against their proceedings, he must tie him up and give him 39 lashes. And if that would not do, give him 39 more until he was sorry for what he had done. And Robinson said he would do it. Okay. This is George Robinson, or Joseph Smith, telling George Robinson that if there's anybody that's speaking against us, you give them 39 lashes. Now, that's a symbolic 39, because 40 lashes, biblically speaking, was known to kill somebody. So it was like, beat them to within an inch of their life. And then if he's not sorry for what he did or said, beat him even more until they are sorry. That is a direct advocation of violence against dissenters. I mean, more so, violence, not only like, everything we've read from Avard and Rigdon and Joe before was like, yeah, just kill them, put them out. And Rigdon was saying, leave them outside for the buzzards to pick their corpses, right? And this is like, no, you beat them to within an inch of their life until they do what you tell them to do. That is sadism right there. That is just downright horrible. And he continues on. About the latter part of July, I heard Sidney Rigdon say that W. Phelps and Dr. Williams, and he strongly suspected John Corrill, were using their influence against the presidency of the church, and further said Corrill and Phelps were men of great influence in the country, and their influence must be put down. I did not go out with the troops in the late expedition to Davies, but my turn was past. 4 or 5 days after the Mormon troops had gone out, I learned that one of my horses was sick, and that I had better go out and attend to him. I went to Diamond and got there in the evening, remained there that night, and returned to Far West next morning. While in Diamond, I saw a great deal of plunder brought in, consisting of beds and bedcloths. I also saw one clock, and I saw 36 head of cattle drove in and put in a pen. All the above property was called consecrated property. And I heard John L. Butler, of Gallatin Day election fame, one of the Mormons who was engaged in assisting to drive the cattle in, say that he had taken the cattle from the citizens of Grindstone Fork and said he had made a valuable expedition. I saw Ebenezer Robinson there, who had a gun barrel in his hand. I asked him where he got it, and he told me that the evening before they had set a barn on fire, and he heard the gun go off while the house was still burning. And he went back and got the barrel out of the ruins of the barn. So they set this house on fire, and I heard a gun go off, and Robinson was like, I want that gun, and goes into this burning building to rescue just the barrel that remained. It's amazing. The following defendants were in the last expedition to Davies, and then it names a whole bunch of people. 2 or 3 days after, let's see, but it goes on to say, 2 or 3 days before the surrender of the Mormons to the militia at Far West, I heard Joseph Smith say that the sword was now unsheathed and should not again be sheathed until he could go through these United States and live in any county he pleased peaceably. That's reasonable, right? I heard this from him also before the last expedition to Davies, when Gallatin and Millport were burnt, as well as afterwards. I heard it on several occasions. I never heard Joseph Smith say that he would disobey the laws of the country. The following of the defendants were in the expedition against Bogart, and then he names off a bunch of people that were involved in the Battle of Crooked River. Next he goes on to say, while the expedition was going on in Davies, there was a meeting in Far West in which Mr. Sidney Rigdon presided. There were present about 60 or 100 men. A guard was put around the house, and one was placed at the door. Mr. Rigdon said that the last man had run away from Far West that was a-going to, that the next man who started, he should be pursued and brought back dead or alive. This was put to vote and agreed to, without anyone objecting to it. He further said that one man had slipped his wind yesterday and had been thrown aside into the brush for the buzzards to pick, and the first man who lisped it should die. Man, Rigdon is powerful. At this meeting, companies were chosen, some to procure wood for the town and some to procure meal for the army at Far West, and also for the families of those who were in the expedition to Davies, and as one company for spies. Sidney Rigdon said that these companies were necessary and appointed men as heads of the companies to make them up. Rigdon further stated at this meeting that the enemy were in their hands and that they should prevail. He gave instructions to the spy company that they should go out to Richmond and surrounding country to learn the movements of the mobs, and that if they found any mob burning houses in Caldwell, be sure, said he, that you do the same thing to them. Amasa Lyman was the captain of this spy company. It was stated in this meeting that the object in organizing a spy company was to be able to guard against mobs, which they said were coming on them from all quarters. When Mr. Rigdon was instructing the spy company, or apparently in conversation with them, above referred to, I heard it said that if they could not get rid of the mob in any other way, they could poison them to death. There's another person saying, I heard Rigdon tell us to poison these people. At the time of this last remark, I was engaged in other conversation and did not hear all that conversation. When Patton was raising his company to go against Bogart, he remarked that it, meaning Bogart's company, was said to be militia, but it was a cursed mob, and that in the name of the Lord he would go and disperse them. And further, this deponent saith not. Signed, Burr Riggs. End quote. So Burr Riggs, he had a bit of a sordid past with the Mormon church, but all in all, he was a faithful Mormon and continued to be so for many years. And we're going to revisit him later on, but I think he enlightened us as to some of these details. He offered a secondary first-hand account, another person saying from a first-hand account that Rigdon told the Danites to go poison these people if they couldn't win. And that there were some people that that if a person spoke of what is said here, that they should be thrown aside into the brush for the buzzards to pick. I mean, this, thanks to Burr Riggs and all of these concurrent testimonies from believing Mormons, we're able to say unequivocally that these things historically did happen. No Missourian was poisoned by a Mormon, but it's interesting to think that that was an option on the table. The next chunk that we're going to read is also taken from the court documents, but it's not a testimony. Out of all of the testimonies I could find, nothing enlightened us to the Haun's Mill massacre. And this was the best example I could find of the court recognizing that it even happened, but they didn't call any witnesses for or against the massacre. It was just swept under the rug. They were much more interested in the military actions taken by the Mormons to see if they could brand Joe as a defective military leader, deserving of the death penalty for treason against the country. Now, this is seriously one of the very few documents in this entire court of inquiry that deals at all with the Haun's Mill massacre, and it's a letter from S.M. Smith reporting on the massacre and the resulting deaths of his brother and nephews. And this is the full text transcription of the letter from S.M. Smith in Kirtland, Ohio to Governor Boggs in Jefferson City, Missouri. Quote, I have received by letter from the widow and others the following facts respecting the murder of a brother in your state by the name of Warren Smith. He was a Mormon, the only one of the connection. He was set out for Far West, Missouri last summer because he believed it, as he said, to do his duty to go. This was a misfortune to be pitied, not a crime to be punished. Warren began a journey with 3 or 4 other families, had arrived to within a short distance of the end of their toilsome journey. They were informed that the roads were strictly guarded, and to proceed further was to be disastrous. They consequently halted at Shoal Creek and encamped in the edge of the prairie when they were attacked on the 6th of November, which is actually the October 30th, by an armed mob of 200 or 300 men, which was actually about 150. The women and children fled to the woods, the men and boys to a log blacksmith shop. The ruffians instantly surrounded the latter and in a few minutes massacred about 20. After the roar of death had ceased and the inhuman banditti retired, the women crept silently from their hiding places and selected each her own husband from among the mangled slain, wiped the warm-flowing lifeblood from their cheeks, snatched a hasty kiss, and buried their lifeless many in a deep narrow tomb together, and fled again to the thick circling shade of the glooming forest to escape a like or a worse fate, and now wander friendless and pitiless without money or means in a strange land, a land of enemies. They perished my brother and a little son of his about 10 years, who begged hard for life, but was shot through the head in cold blood after the excitement of battle was over. If there is philanthropy in Missouri, let it be exercised in relieving the suffering of these widows and orphans. If there is power in the law or energy in the executives of Missouri, let them be put in requisition to bring to punishment the perpetrators of this barbarous deed." End quote. How does one sum up such a complicated conflict with so many moving parts with such broad causal and resultant effects? Now, I guess, let me just start with the legality of everything. This court of inquiry was only quasi-legal, but what was illegal was more what the Missourians actively didn't do instead of what they did do. The court of inquiry was supposed to be reserved for military application only, and they were hoping that they could prove that Joe was acting in a military capacity, thus deserving of a non-civilian court of inquiry that happened. But Joe was never a member of any state militia. Legally speaking, he was a civilian, deserving of a grand jury and subsequent trial. The Missourians actively deprived the Mormons of their right to a fair and speedy trial with a jury of their peers in lieu of acting with monolithic power at the hands of Justice Austin A. King. What's even worse is that no Missourian was held responsible for anything. They got off scot-free. Now we'll get into that in a second because I want to talk about Judge King for a second. We know that he was opposed to the Mormons. He had heard the case on Raglan's farm after the Danites had surrounded the homes of the elected officials to force their signatures on pro-Mormon propaganda. King's friends had been chased from their homes by the Mormons. His own property had lost significant value from the Mormons moving in. He was not an unaffected party, and he had no ground to stand as justice of the peace over the trial like this. He should have had the personal ethics to recuse himself from the case and bring in a justice from a neighboring state to hear the case. And it should have been a grand jury and legitimate civil trial with a jury of peers and proper legal representation. But none of those constitutionally obligated procedures occurred. But if you're in King's position, why wouldn't he want to be the presiding judge over this court? I mean, likely he hated the Mormons, like most non-Mormon Missourians, and he now had his finger on the knob for how they would be treated in the Missouri state legal system. He could pass a judgment nearly as harsh as could be conceived, and the Missourians would laud his name for being tough on those damned religious fanatics. It's hard to ascribe motives to Judge King, but there may have been some underlying prejudices that caused him to be the presiding judge over this quasi-military court of inquiry. Which gets to the seeming central point upon which the prosecution was trying to make their case. If Joe or one of the Mormon leaders could be roped in as a military officer who had gone rogue, they could suddenly forget or neglect a number of constitutionally sanctioned rights. Court-martials are held by the military when somebody in the military steps out of line, and this court of inquiry served the same purpose. It had no civil legal jurisdiction. Somebody convicted in a court-martial enjoys significantly less rights than a convicted civilian. So if the Mormon leaders were tried as military officers, the court-martial that General Lucas held and this court of inquiry presided over by Justice King would hold more weight than a proper civil trial, because everything was being handled at the military level. The problem was, hardly any of the Mormons were actually state militia officers. I mean, they were acting under Joe, Rigdon, and Hiram, and none of them were military actors, and thus everybody was subject to civilian rights in this court. This court of inquiry, there's no other way of saying it, it was a sham trial. The first document that we read, how we opened this episode, was one of many from a fact-finding committee who said that this trial should not be used as evidence for the real jury trial, nor should it even be happening. None of it should be published. But as much as the Mormons were in the wrong for so much of this conflict, the Missouri government was woefully and shamefully unfair to the Mormons, both during and after this conflict. And the most frustrating part is this court of inquiry was the only legal recourse the Mormons ever received for the Haun's Mill Massacre and for all of the wrongs that had been perpetrated against them. And as much as you heard us talk about Haun's Mill Massacre, which was basically nil, that was the extent of the legal exposure the entire massacre ever received. Those 18 men and young boys who were mercilessly slaughtered at Haun's Mill were simply never legally recognized, and their families never received one degree of reconciliation for their loss. You know what they got? Forcefully removed from the state of Missouri. And the real kicker here is the removal of the Mormons from the state of Missouri was deliberated in court for its constitutionality, but it was intentionally tabled until July of 1839, which was long after nearly every Mormon had fled to Illinois. And the issue was never further discussed in any court of law, ever. It was all swept under the rug. The Mormons were out of Missouri, just as the Missourians had wanted, and Joe, Hiram, Rigdon, Lyman White, along with Alexander McCrae and Caleb Baldwin, were all sent to Liberty Jail in Clay County to await a real civil trial, while the remaining 58 Mormon defendants were released for lack of substantial evidence of their collusion with the leadership. So Joe and Hiram would later attempt a meeting with Martin Van Buren, President of the United States, in applying for some kind of redress, a meeting which eventually didn't pan out in their favor. Van Buren threw him out. I made this point in the Haun's Mill Massacre episode, but it bears repeating. Haun's Mill is touted as the height of Mormon persecution. If there is anything that believing members know of church history today, it's the Haun's Mill Massacre. But the worst part is, they have good arguments that the Mormons were wrongfully persecuted. But they're not the arguments they think. They lay the blame squarely on Lilburn Boggs, and we've talked about him ad nauseum. But they lay the blame on him and, the so-called anti-Mormon mobs, but they don't ever ascribe names to those people. But that ignores everything we've been covering for the last, 20 hours of historical timeline since Joe and Rigdon fled to Missouri and started shaking things up. The Mormons were persecuted, but not because they were Mormons. They were subjugated and oppressed in 19th century society like so many other classes of people in different locations at the time. No Mormon ever had it as bad as any black person living in Missouri at this time, okay? No Mormon was forced to endure the Trail of Tears, which was literally happening at this same exact time. Haun's Mill Massacre isn't an argument for Mormon persecution complex, as is this greater Mormon-Missouri war conflict. It's an argument about just how deplorable and twisted people can be towards one another. One thing I do want to get to, and I'm not the only one here, why did the people continue believing in Joe after this debacle? This baffling concept in my mind. Earlier, I read a small excerpt from the manuscript of Reed Peck. This is the document which heavily colored the public perception of the Missouri Mormon War, as it was essentially the authoritative account for 2 years before the Court of Inquiry documents were published in 1841. The final paragraphs of his manuscript seem to say it so well. And this is it. There is a link for it in the show notes on mormoninformation.com. Please read his manuscript. It's amazing. Quote, "You may here ask in conclusion of the story how Joseph Smith retains the confidence of his followers and even bind them more closely to the cause when the ultimate of all his plan has been a total failure. He tells them as an excuse for being in the hands of his enemies after the delivery of so many brave speeches that he was betrayed. The very men who risked their lives at his request to open a communication with the army are now branded as traitors. When no others would venture, we stepped forward and were instrumental in saving the lives of hundreds, perhaps, by bringing about a treaty. Propositions were made to us, and we faithfully reported the same to the presidency, and they understood the whole matter. Still, Joseph pretends to the church that he was betrayed by us as Christ was by Judas. You may ask how he can expect to support his church as a man of God when facts are exhibited to the world in their true light." End quote. In essence, Reed Peck was asking in 1839 the same thing that I'm asking in 2017. How did this church survive? Let me take a little diversion to try and... I'm just going to cue you in to what's going on in my mind here. Lately, Annie and I have been watching Avatar, The Last Airbender. It may be a TV show made for 7-year-olds, but it is an amazing show, and it's full of really profound life lessons. We're on book 1 right now, so essentially we're just getting started. But an episode come up that made me stop and think for quite some time. The Aang gang wandered into a town that was right beneath an active volcano, Pompeii style. And the town was led by a prophetess, and everybody in town followed her every whim. From love advice to not bathing for good luck or whatever, every person in the town wholeheartedly believed whatever the prophetess claimed. Sokka, the skeptical one of the group, went on a campaign to try and debunk the prophetess's claims by challenging the believers with hard questions, to which they always had some kind of non-answer, which seemed to satisfy them and infuriate Sokka even more. And, okay, one person was told that they would find their true love. This is a good example for you. While they were wearing these silly red shoes. So the person then commenced to wear the silly red shoes every day in hopes of meeting his true love. And Sokka pointed out to him that, of course, he would find his true love eventually, and the fact that he was wearing the silly shoes didn't really have an influence on the situation. But the man credulously and excitedly claimed that the prophecy must come true as long as he's wearing his silly red shoes. And I think we can see why this logic paradox was so frustrating to the skeptic of the group. But the episode progresses, and the prophetess comes out with her ancient book and interprets the clouds for what the next year will hold. It's a good year for grain and so on and so forth. But everybody in town wants to know about the volcano. Is it going to go off and explode and bury the town in lava and kill everybody? Well, she prophesied that the town wouldn't be destroyed that year, which was met with cheers of elation from the townsfolk, of course. And as the episode progresses, we find out that the volcano is on the brink of erupting and will soon bury the town if something isn't done. Imminent danger lay on the horizon, and it's up to the heroes of the show to warn the townsfolk to flee before they're all killed. But when they get to the town, they try and explain to the people in the town square that the volcano is going to erupt. The town will be destroyed. The people will be killed. They need to leave. But the people just nonchalantly blow them off because their prophetess had told them the city wouldn't be destroyed by the volcano that year. Nobody would listen to the skeptics who had actually gone up and gotten the evidence, who'd seen the mouth of the volcano with their own eyes. They took more comfort in believing that convenient falsehood of their prophetess. Eventually, the heroes manipulate her powers of prophecy in clever ways, and the prophetess claims that the town will be destroyed, and suddenly everybody believes her and starts to take action, actually starts to work. They dig a trench around the town to channel the lava flow. They evacuate everybody, and thanks to the Avatar, the city wasn't destroyed by the volcano. A point which wasn't lost on the believers in the prophetess, because she had prophesied that the city wouldn't be destroyed. And now she was right through a narrow interpretation of the facts. If not for the Avatar, the prophecy would be destroyed. Her words wouldn't have mattered because the town would have been destroyed and all the people would have died, and there would be nobody left in the town to call her out on that false prophecy. But thanks to human intervention and the clever wit of the Avatar, her prophecy was true, and the people went on believing. There was no way for her to fail in that prophecy. Now, as I said before, it's a TV show made for children, but it's really profound in its own right, and I can't help but notice some incredible parallels. But that's the sad part of it. People will often choose to believe a convenient falsehood in the face of the most brazen and incontrovertible truth. I was talking to Marie, my co-host on My Book of Mormon, and I made this point that Mormons love their struggles. I shouldn't say they, because I experienced this when I was in the church and attending. We think that if we're fighting against our natural man and struggling against that porn or video game addiction or whatever the case is, we're pushing our nose ever harder against the grindstone in our callings, and we're working for the church, and that's what's important. The struggle is what's important. We're always trying to be more righteous. I used to revere my stake patriarch because, he was a feeble old man who had been righteous in the church his entire life, and he would always say, "I just wish I could be better for my heavenly Father." And he was the most pious man I had ever known. But the problem is, those struggles to be righteous are all done while lazily embracing a falsehood. Because admitting the prophet is a false prophet is the greatest struggle of all. Look at these Mormons living in Missouri in 1838. They'd truly gone through hell to embrace Joseph Smith as their infallible prophet. They had lost their property, they'd been deserted by their friends and family, and ultimately some of them lost their lives, and yet they still persisted in their belief that Joe was their one true prophet. But these were lazy struggles. They had embraced their Mormon lives and everything that entailed, but saying that Joe was a false prophet and reconciling the fact that they'd gone through hell the last X number of years of their life, all for a con man, that was the greatest personal fight they each had to wrestle with. It's this stupid sunk cost fallacy we so often find ourselves in. We invest time, energy, thought, money, whatever into someone or something with the hopes that it'll all pay off if we just keep struggling against it. It's much more of a struggle to take a step back and say, all right, something's really wrong here. How did I get here, and what is actually wrong in my life, and am I caught up in a sunk cost fallacy? Do any of you get there with car repairs? You keep thinking, after this injector, coil, spark plug, and valve replacement, this car's going to run perfect. Until it inevitably breaks down again. The hardest part of the struggle against that lemon car is stepping back and saying, this car sucks, and it's taking all my money, and it will never run perfectly. Humans hate to realize they've been wasting their money, but that's even more motivational when they've been wasting their time, and even more so, their belief. These Mormons believed that Joe was their prophet. They'd invested their time, money, and even more frustratingly, their belief into this man. And everything that transpired in 1838 would cause any sane person to say that Joe is obviously a con artist and he has no idea what he's doing. But they were hopped up on belief. And sanity has little to do with belief in prophets and their professed divinity. The truth of the matter is, it's hard to walk away from something you've invested time and energy into for years, even when you're faced with hard facts that should cause every person to walk away. Reed Peck said it perfectly. You may ask how he can expect to support his church as a man of God when facts are exhibited to the world in their true light. You know, I've been wondering that for 4.5 years, since I began studying Mormon history in depth. When the facts are laid out to the world in their true light, how can people continue to believe in this church? Now, Peck was asking the profound and unanswerable question in 1839 when the church had 10,000 members. I'm asking in 2017 when they claim to have 15 million members. How can people know of Joe's false prophecies and still call him a prophet? How can a church built on someone we can factually verify as a con artist survive? And the sad realization behind that is people will often choose a convenient falsehood, even if it entails all kinds of struggles, as long as they don't have to contend with an inconvenient truth that they might be wrong and they might have been duped by somebody. Very few people I talk to who have left the church actually complain about the money that they gave in tithing. The vast majority say, I can't believe I was in it for X number of decades and didn't know about, the Book of Abraham, but you can fill in the Book of Abraham with any other church issue. The formula still holds true. Those people aren't angry about the church taking their money. They're upset because they were lied to. And it took them gaining new perspective and embracing an inconvenient truth in order to understand that lie. It took overcoming that greatest personal struggle by saying, maybe I was wrong and I got duped. People just simply don't like to be lied to. If only the church today could get that through its thick, gentrifying skull that this is why people are leaving in droves and searching for something else. All of the bubbles on that enemies of the church slide that Ryan McKnight leaked could be replaced with one large bubble that says, because we lie to them. Reed Peck couldn't see how the church would survive after Joe's incarceration. I don't see how it'll survive the internet age. But the truth of the matter is, we're both wrong. The church will go on. It'll survive in some bastardized form of its original self, and people 100 years from now will be studying the historical Joseph Smith and wonder why the hell anybody is a Mormon then. And maybe we've accessed some kind of objective truth with humanity in all of this. We would much rather believe a convenient lie than a harsh truth. We don't want to face the music and understand that we screwed up somehow. We don't want to admit that we're wrong and our investment of time, energy, and money, and most importantly, belief, was all a waste. The problem with us humans is the truth doesn't care what we believe. The truth just is. And oftentimes, we lie because the truth simply sucks too much, or we're afraid of what will happen if we're wrong. Maybe, like some of the saints living in Missouri, we're worried about the punishment for honesty. John Corrill, Reed Peck, Burr Riggs, William Wines Phelps, they all suffered the wrath of the leadership and became pariahs among their friends and family because they spoke the truth against the prophet. They became traitors, and the followers of Joe were further solidified in their persecution narrative because they thought that these traitors were just doing to Joe what Judas did to Jesus. Following Joseph Smith is lazy. It was then, it is now. Most of these people would rather bury their heads in the sand than struggle with the fact that Joe might be lying to them. Joe made a number of claims during this conflict that would put him into the category of a false prophet in a second. What's more, he didn't see how things would turn out as you may expect that a real prophet would. He claimed that angels would fight and supplement the numbers that the Mormons had against the Missouris. Yet the Mormons were slaughtered at Haun's Mill and inflicted very few wounds on their Missourian assailants. Joe claimed that the Lord would damn the mob and the Mormons could kill 10 as easily as 10,000, but every indication shows us that the Missourians would have utterly wiped the Mormons off the face of the planet if it came down to mortal combat. Not only were his prophecies false, but he didn't foresee that the Mormons would die at Haun's Mill and during the subsequent months of their removal from Missouri. He didn't foresee Liberty Jail and thought he was going to be slaughtered as the militia carried him and the other surrendered Mormons towards Richmond for this court of inquiry. He didn't foresee that he would escape from Liberty Jail or that Rigdon would go off the rails in the coming years. He didn't foresee that John Bennett, James Strang, Brigham Young, or Major Bideman would become leaders of his church after his death 5 years from where our timeline sits. He never gave us one solid prophecy that came true. And the vast majority of his prophecies were either benign or simply wrong. And still, people believe him to be a prophet of God. Joseph Smith, the founding prophet of the church, who claimed to have healing powers, could not even heal Captain Fear Not's bullet wounds. Captain Fear Not was sent on a mission for the church to liberate people who had been captured by damned mobocrats. Joseph sent him by divine revelation to go do this mission and had been telling him for months that he can kill 10 or 10,000 because angels will reinforce it. Joseph Smith couldn't even heal Captain Fear Not in that situation. With his blessings and Melchizedek priesthood and anointings, they still believed he was a prophet. You know what? Say what you will, but I would be cautious of anybody that claims to be telling the truth. If somebody says something and then they say, believe me, right after, maybe consider questioning what they said before. Skepticize it. The truth is self-evident and doesn't need any prophets to advocate for it. You don't need to go to weekly meetings to solidify what truth is. I don't claim to tell you the truth on this show. I merely present information I found in my research, and it's incumbent upon you, the listener, to look into it for yourself and decide if it's true. But I never say, believe me, Joe's totally a con man. I just straight up call him a con man, and I have years of research to back that up if somebody wishes to challenge such a claim. What I'm trying to say is you can struggle through life on behalf of somebody that claims to have the truth, or you can struggle through life on a search for truth. I've chosen my path and it's led me to drive across the country in search of more truth. I can only express the truth I've come to know and hope that you share that same insatiable hunger for truth that I do. Let's find true Mormon history together and dethrone once and for all the claims of false prophets.
It's time for Mormon Mimsies.
If I show you something, promise you won't tell?
Like a secret? Really? Cool.
All right, let's get into a Mormon Mimsy. So last week, Mormon Mimsy was this, quote, "The children were busy when the schoolroom door was carefully opened and two gentlemen entered carrying the limp form of Joseph Smith. The children all sprang to their feet, for Brother Joseph lay helpless in their arms, his head resting on his brother's shoulder, his face pale as death, but his eyes were open, though he seemed not to see things earthly. The teacher quieted them by telling them that Brother Joseph was in a revelation, and they were carrying him to his office above the schoolroom." End quote. All right. Simple Mormon Mimsy, who was this quoting? And we had one person who got it, Bruce Holt on Twitter, hashtagged it Mormon Mimsy. He said this, "I believe it was Adeline Knight Belknap who is quoted by a daughter as saying this." Well done, Bruce Holt. He is the winner of this week's Mormon Mimsy. And that is taken out of the Utah Pioneer Biographies, Volume 4, Number 31, page 150, related by the daughter of Adeline Knight Belknap. Good job on that, Bruce. Thanks for playing along with Mormon Mimsy. Normally, this is the time when we would give another Mormon Mimsy for next week, but as we know from the intro of this episode, we're going on hiatus, so we will put Mormon Mimsies on hold for when we reboot. That being said, we kind of gave Patreon the hard sell at the beginning of the episode. Well, it is time to thank our Hall of Famer patrons. These are the patrons who've been supporting at a large amount or for a long time that really supply the backbone of structure for this show that it lives on. So thank you to Preston, Jay, Chris and Christy, Tyler, Judy, Frank, Clara, Dario, Randy, Mindy, Karen, Colette, Greg, Eric, Cam, Mark, Larry, Clint, Scott, Philip, Stuart, Jared, Corrine, David, Howard, Brandon, Sean, David, Doug, Doonan, Joseph, ZemuX Zenu, George, Hal, Heather and Brandon, Bevan, Darren, Marie, John, Lee, and Michelle. You know, we gave Patreon the hard sell at the beginning of this episode, but those are the people that have really done a lot to support this and keep this going as a full-time endeavor. So to all of those people, thank you from the absolute depths of my heart. Your hard-earned cash is well appreciated and well used in perpetuating this work and making it better every day. All right. Wow. I guess it's that time, isn't it? This has been a long episode, but we are done for today. I want to thank everybody for listening. I know that occasionally we have longer episodes like this, but sometimes it's necessary to really get through all of the information. And this was one of those that I couldn't cut short because there was so much to get through. So thank you for hanging in there for the entire episode. And I look forward to talking at you soon when we reboot and we jump into the Nauvoo years, because there's so much to talk about there. We're probably going to be going at an even slower pace than we've been taking some of our time getting up to the Missouri years. So it's, like I said, there's just so much to cover and so many new people to talk about. But we need to shut it down. Not for the night, but for the month. And before shutting it down, I need to thank a few people. First off, I need to thank Demonista for running the Facebook page, as well as to the real Emma Hale for running the Twitter handle. Thank you both for doing that. I need to thank Jason Camo for providing the music in the show, used it with his permission. Go to aloststateofmind.com to download his music there. Thank you, Craig Keeling, for providing the artwork in the show. Go to weirdmormonshit.com to check out his blog. Legal counsel for the show is provided by the law offices of P. Andrew Torres. Be sure to check out the Opening Arguments podcast. If you'd like to leave a voicemail talking about anything, your transition story, or anything that comes up, or preferably a correction to make, you can do so at 864-NAKED-MO, 864-625-3366, and that voicemail will be played in the next show if you so wish. And of course, I need to thank once again all the patrons who support the show, but most of all, for the 2.5 years that we've been doing this, and for listening to today's episode, and hopefully for tuning in May when we reboot. I need to thank all of the listeners for sticking with me through this journey for 2.5 years. It has been such a pleasure to work with you and to be your obedient servant, as is sign-offs and common 1830s letters and whatnot. This is your host, Bryce Blankenagel, signing off. I hope to talk to you soon, here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. preceding podcast is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, all rights reserved.